Chapter 529. This gigantic devil was covered in crimson scales, and a pair of large bat-like wings extended from his back. Green venom dripped from his mouth, landing on the ground and stirring up clouds of smoke. On his waist, there was a belt with 12 screaming angel heads hanging from it. Without a doubt, these heads are the spoils of war he had cut off with a flaming greatsword in his claw-like hands. He was Bardi, the temporary lord of the first layer of Bator, Avernus. He was a rising star in the 9 hells of Bator. Though he looked ferocious on the outside, Bayer was quick-witted and resourceful. He was adept at betrayal, and ambush. Using his sharp mind, he was always one step ahead of his opponents. The other 8 lords of the 9 prisons of Bader had taken a liking to Bayer's strengths. Though they were unwilling to form an alliance with him, they had never stopped plotting against him. That was why they had agreed to let him take charge of the front lines of the blood war. Bayer knew the meaning of his existence, so he worked hard every day. He spent most of his time on the blood war against the bottomless abyss, constantly patrolling the defenses and formulating battle strategies. All of this left him racking his brains, even forgetting to eat and sleep. To be honest, he was doing well. However, that was only so far. In fact, he was facing a thorny problem. The expeditionary army of Bator that had been sent to the acid fog canyon to participate in the crusade against the tyrant worm had lost contact with the rear. The 9 purgatories below, standing in front of the cursed bone gate, Bayer rubbed his eyes with his coarse fingers to soothe his agitated emotions. Though he was still under the protection of centaurs and pit fiends, he did not feel safe at all. He knew his own value, and he also knew that he had no right or opportunity to fail. If he failed in the blood war, even if it was just a small problem on the battlefield, he would lose the trust of Nessus. Without the support of the Astamors, what awaited him would be a fate countless times more tragic than death. "You bunch of lowly demons," Bayer roared, his corrosive saliva splashing everywhere. Smoke rose from the bodies of the devil guards around him, but they did not dare to make a sound. "How long do we have to wait before we can reconnect to the acid fog canyon?" 2 pit fiends who were proficient in spatial magic immediately fell to the ground in fear when they heard their master's question. They had adjusted the coordinates no less than 800 times, but there was no response from the cursed bone gate. It was as if the acid fog canyon had disappeared into the multiverse. The evil dragon had made similar attempts before. Several powerful ancient red dragons had used kindred orientation spells, but they were still unable to locate the Megalosaurus army. Thanks to the concealment of the god of virtual games Stim, the acid fog canyon was situated between virtual reality and reality. Apart from certain special beings, even legendary tier spellcasters would not be able to sense the exact location of that plane. Naturally, it was impossible to re-establish a connection with it. No matter how they tried, it was to no avail. "Wasting time is wasting life," Bayer declared coldly. "You are plotting against my life." With a single sentence, he labeled the 2 pit fiends as treason for their powerlessness. If they were caught, they would be demoted. A faint purple ray shot out from Bayer's hand, accurately hitting the 2 trembling pit fiends. Bound by their true names, they were unable to put up any resistance. In the end, they wailed and turned into 2 demented lesser demons. Bayer, who was still angry, did not let them go. He lifted his foot and stomped the 2 lesser demons to death. All the devils present kept quiet out of fear. The representatives sent by the evil Dragon Council also turned their heads to the side. However, the Megalosaurus seemed to have sensed some movement, and they quickly lowered their heads to the ground to show their obedience. A 5-headed Megalosaurus that was as large as a mountain suddenly appeared, slowly descending beside the cursed bone gate. Great evil Dragon Queen. Seeing his nominal ally, Bayer still bowed politely and greeted him, even though it was just a projection. From the demeanor of this great devil, it was impossible to imagine his rage and his atrocities just now. How was the Otherworld Gate? With the enhancement of the Cursed Bone Gate, is it possible to reconnect with the Acid Fog Canyon? Without any pretense, Tiamat's projection asked straightforwardly because she was extremely anxious at the moment. Of course, she was anxious not because she was worried about the safety of the Megalosaurus army, but because of the unforeseen circumstances in the crusade against the tyrant worm. That abominable worm wanted to become a god, but it did not stop Tiamat. Instead, it wanted to get its hands on the Megalosaurus divine title. As the holder of the Megalosaurus divine title in the multiverse, and the one and only holder of this divine title, Tiamat could not tolerate a bug-like creature having similar authority to her. It was disrespectful to her, a serious blasphemy. That was why she spent time and effort to gather the five-colored Megalosaurus to form an army and join the bloody battle in the acid fog canyon. Because only by killing the tyrant worm in the abyss could she completely destroy the demon lord who wanted to get his hands on the Megalosaurus divine title. For this, Tiamat even reached a temporary truce with her mortal enemy, the platinum dragon god Bahamut, so that she could spare all her energy to completely destroy the tyrant worm. Originally, she wanted to wait for the Bahamut expeditionary army to expand their advantage and force the true body of the tyrant worm to join the battle. Then, she would personally descend to the acid fog canyon and kill the blasphemous worm in one fell swoop. But now, the Bahamut expeditionary army had lost contact with the rear. She did not have any definite information about the progress of the war over there, whether the tyrant worm had successfully become a god, or whether the Megalosaurus divine title had been tainted. How could Tiamat not be anxious? Previously, she had tried to let the evil Dragon Council establish contact with the acid fog canyon, but it did not work. Helplessly, she could only wait for Barty to use the hidden divine artifact of Avernus, the Cursed Bone Gate, a portal specially used to transfer troops for the Blood War, to try to find the acid fog canyon. But it was still unsuccessful. Chapter 530. Awkwardness spread, and Bayer, who was equally helpless, smiled awkwardly, attempting to use some clever words to divert the Dragon Queen's attention. Perhaps we can launch an expedition. Without waiting for the Archdevil to speak, Tiamat's projection raised her head and looked at the sky of Avernus that was filled with rain of fire. Expedition. Bayer was proficient in all sorts of tactics and strategies, so he knew the true meaning of this phrase. He couldn't help but exclaim. The devils of Bader had not done this for many years. At the beginning of the Blood War, they had only used this tactic when they were fighting against the demons. The current Blood War had long since stopped sending large armies across the astral plane, launching fierce attacks from the outside of the abyss. After all, this was basically challenging all the demon lords, and they would be besieged by a massive army of demons from the abyss. In the current Blood War, apart from the normal battles between the Grey Plains and the 10,000 Abyss Plains, there were more scalpels that struck with precision. Be it devils or demons, these demons of the lower planes were all proficient in teleportation spells. Building a portal to another world was not difficult. Take the devils, for example. Keys had airdropped them into the acid fog canyon in order to build Hell's Gate. As long as there was an obvious beacon, the devils would be able to build a stable interplanar passage and send out expeditionary troops. For the devils, this innovation had many benefits. It could negate the disadvantage of having too many demons, maximizing the advantage of the elites of the Bader army. At the same time, it could prevent the accidental collapse of a battle line, leading to a large-scale chain of defeats in the Blood War. In a sense, this innovation also reduced the intensity of the bloody battlefield and reduced the casualties of the Bartholomew's 9 Hells in a short period of time. This allowed the devils to rely on the resources of the 9 planes to resist the abyss, which had a higher potential for war. Hence, when Tiamat suggested using primitive tactics, Bayer could not agree to it no matter what. Madam Tiamat. The great demon did not use words like great or dragon queen, which sounded more respectful. From his words, one could feel that his attitude had become firm. I cannot agree with your point of view, and at the same time, I will not sign any orders related to it. He pushed aside the pit fiend bodyguard beside him and walked up to Tiamat's projection, speaking in an unquestionable tone. This concerns the overall situation of the Blood War. I hope that Lord Tiamat can understand. unless Lord Astamores authorizes me. Mentioning the existence of Nessus, Barty was indeed trying to subdue the Penishade Dragon Queen. After all, he was a god, and at least half of the abyssal dragons in Avernus would obey his orders. As long as Tiamat opened her mouth, those devils with the blood of the evil dragon would most likely take the initiative to join her expeditionary army. Are you threatening me? He's just stating a fact, but his words lack consideration, so I need to make some additions. A calm voice suddenly sounded, but other than Barty and Tiamat's projection, no one else noticed it. "My lord, Astamores." The tall and majestic deputy lord instantly lowered his body. Bayer knelt on one knee and saluted the humanoid creature who was walking over. He remained kneeling after saluting, as if he would not get up until the end of time unless the other party agreed. "There's no need for that. We are all serving the will of the 9 prisons of Bader. Moreover, the deputy lord and the lord have the same noble status." Like a gentle elder, Astamos slowly approached the cursed bone gate while speaking in a candid manner. He raised his palm, and Bayer could not help but straighten his body, as if he was a puppet being controlled. However, it wasn't Astamos himself who displayed such power. In fact, it wasn't even his avatar. Similar to Tiamat, Astamores only sent his projection to participate in this meeting. No one knew the true appearance of the Lord of 9 prisons. The image shown by this projection was the disguise that Astamores usually used. He was about 13 feet tall, with shiny black skin and hair. His face was thin and ancient. From his blood-red eyes, there was an evil and demonic light. There was a pair of sharp little horns on his forehead, and he looked inexplicably playful. The clothes he wore were a gorgeous robe inlaid with black diamonds and rubies, and he held a ruby scepter that symbolized power in his hand. The arrival of Astamores was indeed beyond Tiamat's expectations. To be honest, although the Penishade Dragon Queen had an agreement with this devil and was considered an ally in the trenches, she still did not want to have too much contact with him. There was no other reason. Tiamat just felt danger. To be associated with Astamores for any existence was tantamount to frantically testing the edge of death. In terms of strength alone, even those great divine powers might not be able to guarantee that they would be able to defeat this primordial demon. As if he understood Tiamat's thoughts, Astamores did not care about the awkward silence at this time. He took the initiative to start a conversation. "My lady, please forgive me. The words of the acting Lord of Bayer just now were indeed a little harsh and rude. After all, he is still young. I can't apologize on his behalf, but I can give you an opinion as a supplement. Of course, the final decision is still in your hands." Tiamat nodded cautiously, and then her projection instantly dissipated, leaving only a lady in a black veil standing in the same place. In order to show that she valued Astamores, the Penishade Dragon Queen sent one of her avatars to talk with Astamores. "What's your opinion?" Hearing Tiamat's question, a smile appeared on the face of the Lord of Devils. He replied in a warm and gentle voice. "Killing that worm is your goal. If necessary, why don't you change your way of thinking or change your means? The problem now is that we can't establish a gate between the alternate world and the acid fog canyon, or rather, we can't directly descend to that plane. That plane of the abyss seems to be covered with a layer of slippery protective cover by some existence, causing spatial spells to be unable to be anchored. That protective cover seems to be between illusion and reality, and it's very difficult to destroy with the current means. Unless Astamores kept Tiamat in suspense, as if he was waiting for Tiamat to ask the question herself, and, as expected, Tiamat did. "What means do you have, or rather, what price do I have to pay in order to obtain the support you provide?" The conversation between the two bosses made Bayer feel that he was indeed lacking in knowledge. At least in terms of the knowledge of the devils, there was still a big gap between him and the Lord of 9 Hells. The words spoken by Astamores always made people feel as if they were bathing in the spring breeze and felt sincere. However, that was actually impossible. Some people think that the method is very valuable, but I don't think so. A vivid smile appeared on Astamore's face, making it hard to believe that it was just a projection. So I will tell you that instead of wasting effort to remove the protective cover, it's better to directly destroy the plane of the acid fog canyon from inside. Without flesh and blood, there's naturally no place for hair to attach to. The tyrant worm can either choose to die inside or come out to die. Chapter 531. True Name. Seeing Tiamat's doubtful expression, Astamores used a certain method to convey his intentions to her. Bayer, who was standing at the side, was completely unaware of all this. In fact, apart from the Penishade Dragon Queen and the acting Lord of the Nine Hells, no one else knew of the arrival of the Lord of the Nine Hells. It was still doubtful whether this Devil Lord was the strongest in the multiverse, but when it came to keeping secrets, no one could compare to him. What was even more frightening was that in order to carry out his schemes, he could lay down foreshadowing for tens or even hundreds of thousands of years, waiting for the right time. For example, he had grasped the true names of almost all greater devils. This foreshadowing had come in handy now. Due to the nature of the Batsu people, all devils will be shackled by their true names, unless they've already deviated from their alignment. As long as the devil is still in the multiverse, he'll have to respond accordingly. Even if there's a barrier outside the acid fog canyon, by using his true name, he'll still be able to smoothly control the actions of the devils trapped in that plane. Astamores gave an explanation. Although it wasn't very detailed, Tiamat quickly understood the essence of his opinion with her wisdom and knowledge as a god. What I need to pay, and to what extent can you achieve by using your true name? The Dragon Queen asked bluntly. 13 pit fiends. 5 of them are about to advance to the rank of Soul Pit Fiend. I can use my true name to make them willingly offer up all their worth. It'll form a terrifying curse that can be used to destroy the core of the acid fog canyon. Astamore smiled as he spoke, as if he was talking about a trivial matter. He even seemed a little indifferent. However, the evil in his words caused Tiamat, who is also a god of the evil alignment, to tremble in fear. No wonder, glancing at Bayer, who was still unaware, the Penishade Dragon Queen thought to herself, he doesn't want anyone else to know about this. Using his true name to force the pit fiends to offer up all their worth would make all greater devils unable to eat or sleep in peace. This was because almost all of their true names were in the hands of Astamores. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, the Lord of the Nine Hells had created a place for advancement called the Dark Auditorium. Since then, most greater devils had walked out of the Dark Auditorium. When they advanced, they had to recite their true names. Only then would the Dark Auditorium use the power of the 9 prisons of Bader to acknowledge the devils and bless them to advance. At the same time, the true names that were recited would be transmitted to Astamores. You didn't answer me, she said, staring at the projection of the Devil Lord's projection. What do I have to pay you? The acting feudal lord I appointed is very paranoid. He doesn't trust the other Batsu because he's worried about Zariel's restoration. The abyssal draconic demon you created is actually quite trusted by him, so I hope you can give him a little more help. Out. Is Tidit was of tier. After careful consideration and weighing the pros and cons, Tidit found that she had no choice but to agree. I can give you control of the abyssal draconic demon, the Penishade Dragon Queen's avatar replied, but you have to wait until I kill that worm. Although it was said to be for Barty's sake, in reality, Astamores was just placing a spy by his side. The Lord of the Nine Hells smiled again after receiving a reply. Thank you for your generosity, but as you know, he raised the ruby scepter in his hand and tapped it lightly. A projection of a tumbling river appeared in front of him. Devils believe in contracts more than verbal promises, Astamores said solemnly with a solemn expression. Tidit had no choice but to sign a contract with the Devil Lord and use the river Styx as a witness. Astamores carefully put away the contract that had been conjured into his robes and began to carry out the contract. He walked slowly towards the Cursebone Gate. He did not chant or make any hand gestures. However, his ruby scepter was flashing, occasionally revealing a long stretch of purgatory runes that were as small as mosquitoes. Astamores walked to the cursed bone door and reached out his hand to gently touch the bones on the door frame. In the center of the bone door, a red mist appeared. It was spinning, flipping, and taking on various forms. This was the sign that the cursed bone door was connected to another dimension. The previous spellcasters had tried to connect to the acid fog canyon, but had failed. The red mist that they summoned was at most the size of a fist. It was not even 1% of the Lord of the Nine Hells. However, in order to fully connect, the red mist would have to cover the entire cursed bone door. It was still far from that. However, Astamores did not need to do that. Found it. The Devil Lord sensed the coordinates of the distant dimension and said with certainty, "This is the dimension of the acid fog canyon." Immediately after, he used the ruby scepter in his other hand to hit the red mist 13 times. Every strike would disperse a portion of the fog. When the final gouge was completed, the entire red fog that had been summoned by him disappeared. It's done. The shortest is 3 days, and the longest will not exceed 7 days. The acid fog canyon dimension will be destroyed by the curse. The dimension of the acid fog canyon. Stopping beside the last fortress, the new boom town waited quietly. Its city intestine was desperately digesting the new boom town. In just 5 days, this traction city had swept through more than 50 Fort Bodor in succession, gathering all the resources and manpower they had. Other than the first few ignorant Fort Bodor generals who actively resisted and died in the end, the other commanders wisely chose to surrender. Therefore, Keyes gathered a large number of demon soldiers. However, the new boom town still did not have enough space to accommodate them. They could only be divided according to their fighting strength. The stronger devils were placed in the city, while the weaker ones could only follow the traction city on foot. Now that there were no targets to gather, Keyes immediately gathered all the Fort Bodor generals. He wanted to mobilize them before the great battle. Everyone. The young blue dragon nodded as he looked at the greater demons that filled up the audience room. He was about to begin his speech. However, something unexpected happened at this moment. Of the 50 or so generals, more than 40 were pit fiends. Among them, there were even 5 that were close to advancing to the unique pit fiend realm. These 5 powerful pit fiends were the first to react. Their eyes widened as blood spurted out of their orifices. Soon after, the other 8 pit fiends were in a similar situation. A total of 13 pit fiends were bleeding profusely. All the Fort Bodor generals were on guard against the others, especially the young blue dragon sitting at the head of the table. Chapter 532. It was no wonder that the devil generals were wary of Keyes. With the nature of devils, they were already restraining themselves. Of course, this was partly due to their fear of the young blue dragon's strength, but it was also due to their suspicion of what had happened to the pit fiends. According to the logic of devils, even if they wanted to get rid of their enemies, it was best not to do so in public. The pit fiends that were in trouble were scattered all over the place, appearing in random corners of the audience room. If Keyes really wanted to kill them to establish his might, he would have gathered them together and dealt with them all at once. To be able to become the commander of Bator, none of these devil generals were brainless fools. Thus, they were more worried about another possibility. It could have been a premeditated assassination, an act of revenge on the part of Stim or the Tyrant of Worms. If not for the fact that they were worried that the young blue dragon would make things difficult for them afterwards, they would have wanted to leave as soon as possible. Although they did not leave immediately, they were frantically casting all sorts of defensive spells on themselves. Detect poison, anti-justice aura, flame shield. Looking at the magic light that lit up in his arcane vision, Quest snorted, and his vast and boundless spirit ability was suddenly activated. With the increase in his strength, Keyes' usage of his spirit ability had not changed much. However, the total amount of his spirit capacity was frighteningly high. With his own strength, he was able to forcefully destroy all the spells in the audience room and seal the minds of everyone present. Noisy, the young blue dragon spat out coldly, and then turned his gaze to the 13 pit fiends. The sudden burst of light from the spells had interfered with his observation, and he had not been able to see many minute changes clearly. According to Keyes' observations, these pit fiends that had become bloodied were most likely cursed by some sort of sudden curse. Furthermore, based on his judgment, this curse was not something that the god of virtual games, Stim, would use for revenge. Otherwise, since he could curse them, wouldn't it be better to let them self-destruct? Wouldn't that bring more trouble to Keyes? Of course, Keyes didn't let his guard down. He didn't even use any spells or spiritual abilities, as he was worried that he'd trigger some sort of restriction. Instead, he used the force field of the Force Dragon to lift them up and throw them out of Traction City. Due to the danger, he did not call out to his companions. He just stood there and waited for the final result of the curse. After all, cursing 13 pit fiends at the same time was no easy feat. There had to be a bigger scheme behind this. However, due to the interference of the other demon generals, Keyes was unable to observe the minute changes at the start of the curse. Therefore, he couldn't make a judgment right now. He could only use a safer method to minimize the possible damage. Fortunately, this curse didn't take Keyes too long. About half an hourglass later, the 13 pit fiends woke up from their dazed state. Not only did they not try to heal themselves, they even used more extreme methods to destroy their own bodies. Their actions were uniform. First, they reached their hands behind their backs and tore off their wings. Then, they grabbed the horns on their heads and forcefully broke them. They used their sharp claws to tear off their flesh and blood, turning themselves into ragdolls. Not long after, perhaps because he was the weakest, a heavily injured pit fiend collapsed in a pool of his own blood. The blood that originated from his body seemed to have turned into a highly corrosive liquid at this time. Soon, the remaining flesh and the body parts that were previously torn off were all dissolved into a blood-red ointment. There were bubbles on it from time to time. Next, a second, a third, a fourth. A total of 13 pit fiends collapsed, turning into paste on the ground. Keyes' brows furrowed tightly as he watched the remains of the pit fiends fuse together into a small lake. After all, the fiends of the lower realms were creatures of soul and body as one. Their flesh and soul were inseparable. The blood lake that appeared in front of Keyes contained the souls of 13 pit fiends. 5 of them were unique pit fiends. They were at the peak of Batsu's path of advancement. Every pit fiend was a powerhouse that had walked over mountains of corpses and seas of blood. Their experiences fully demonstrated what it meant to be a general builds his success on the bones of 10,000. The amount of resources that were needed was probably not enough even if the same number of material planes were used. Due to the nature of creatures of the lower realms, most of those resources would be used to strengthen their own souls. One could only imagine how precious the souls of pit fiends were. They were definitely precious treasures of the 9 prisons of Bader. Using the soul of a pit fiend to strengthen a spell would definitely be at the legendary rank. But now, this curse had actually combined the souls of 13 pit fiends. While Karth didn't know what would happen next, he had a rough guess based on his intuition and knowledge. He was deeply shaken by his own guess. This must be the doing of that existence. Only he knows the true names of all the pit fiends. Only by using the power of the true names can he control them across planes. He's either trying to break through the plane's seal or using the power of the curse to attack Stim and the Tyrant Worm. Or perhaps he suddenly thought of a possibility, and Keyes immediately teleported back to Traction City. He immediately gave the order to activate the engine. Fortunately, as Traction City was an extremely large machine, its engine would not be completely extinguished. At most, it would be in a standby state. Thus, less than a tenth of an hourglass after Keyes gave the order, the tracks under the base began to move once more. Following closely behind the mobile fortress, the army of devils outside New Prosperity Town also quickly moved out, retreating to even further places. Sand and dust filled the air, and figures flickered in and out. Only the tracks left behind a deep trench and a small blood-red lake on the ground. The avatar of the Prince of Darkness had been observing Keyes all this time, and had only removed his invisibility after Traction City had left. He could clearly see me, but he pretended not to see me. ZT felt a little indignant at being ignored. Traction City is like a knight attacking from behind. I'd like to see what's wrong with this pool of blood. Could it be? Chapter 533. As if to verify his words, ZT was just about to extract something from the pool of blood for his own observation and research when something strange happened. Like a bathtub with a drain, a whirlpool appeared in the middle of the pool of blood. The scarlet ointment slowly seeped into it, and before long, the pool of blood disappeared without a trace. This is... ZT walked forward suspiciously, wanting to investigate the cause of the leak. I have to leave quickly. With his astonishing eyesight, he quickly found the passage where the pool of blood had disappeared. It was a hole about the size of a fist, extending straight into the depths of the acid fog canyon. The hole was pitch black, and when one looked down, they could only see some flashing red spots. Of course, this was only the view of an ordinary person. The Dark Prince's eyes could see much more. It was precisely because of this that he'd turned pale with fright. He'd even thought of leaving the acid fog canyon as soon as possible. The paste that had been mixed with the flesh and souls of the 13 pit fiends had actually seeped into the depths of the plane, corroding its core. The so-called plane core was actually a source core that could be condensed into a plane. It could absorb the surrounding matter and use it to achieve the effect of stabilizing the plane. However, apart from being sturdy enough, this type of origin core was not very useful. It was also very difficult to use. Generally speaking, although the demon lords and demon lords of the lower planes had the ability to shatter a plane source core, they would rarely lay their hands on a plane source core even if they wanted to destroy a plane. This was because the gains did not make up for the losses. Take the demon lords, for example. The battles between them were as long as bloody battles. But the cause of the battles was either hatred or the accumulation of resources and wealth. Ultimately, there had to be benefits. Destroying the plane core of an opponent's territory could certainly weaken their forces, but after the plane collapsed, the most precious treasure of the plane, souls, would no longer be able to be harvested endlessly even if they won. This was a completely short-sighted act. Even the abominations that lived to destroy all things, and the ancient evils that had no sense of reason, would not choose to do this. Their actions were also inclined towards slaughtering the living beings of a plane, and then waiting for them to slowly recover before harvesting leaks in batches. Moreover, there were very few planes in the multiverse that could give birth to souls. For example, the seemingly endless planes in the bottomless abyss were actually the result of deliberate accumulation under the guidance of the abyss will. This was the foundation of the bottomless abyss. If any demon lord dared to risk universal condemnation and destroy a plane's origin core, the will of the abyss would probably descend immediately and teach them how to be demons. Besides, destroying a plane's origin core was an extremely difficult thing to do, apart from the fact that there weren't many benefits and there were many risks involved. Purely physical methods were almost useless. Not only were most of the plane's source cores hidden in the depths of the plane, but they were also especially sturdy. As for spells, most of them had to be top-notch legendary spells. In terms of the requirements and difficulty of performing it, it was at least on par with the level of Karsistin's divine spell. In truth, Astamor seemed to be doing it casually, but he'd used his true name to control the 13 pit fiends. He'd used the power of their flesh and souls to indirectly cast this curse. While the pit fiends could be killed, they would most likely be reborn 99 years later in Bador after a normal death. If they had other methods, they might be reborn much earlier. They'd definitely lose some of their strength, but the most serious consequence would be a drop in rank. However, their flesh and souls have been mixed into this curse by the Devil Lord. There is absolutely no chance of them being reborn. In terms of value, the resources needed to create the 13 pit fiends might even be more than the total amount of resources in the Acid Fog Canyon. Therefore, Astamors had invested heavily in this, using a method that was more powerful than he was to destroy a plane's origin core. If not for the benefits he'd obtained from Tiamat, the shrewdness of the Devil Lord would definitely not have allowed him to do this. Using this method, in a sense, the effect was absolutely remarkable. In less than 2 hourglasses, the curse had already gnawed at the surface of the plane's source core. If Stim hadn't concealed the acid fog canyon, the will of the abyss would have sensed that something was wrong with the plane's origin core. It would most likely descend here in anger. However, the first to sense it was the god of virtual games. It felt as if he'd set up a server here and was operating a game. Originally, it was just a player challenging the operating rules, but someone had suddenly barged into the computer room and started smashing the server without a second word. This feeling could be said to be unparalleled. Asterisk Stim, who'd been arguing with Buffett, suddenly flushed red. He then spat out dark golden blood. However, he didn't have the time to care about his injuries. Various data appeared in his eyes as he nervously searched for the source of the problem. Because he spoke too quickly, he spat out another mouthful of blood. Is destroying the plane's origin core, damn it. Hearing Stim's words, Buffett, who was standing in front of him, turned pale with fright. Who has the guts to do this, dwarf? Speak quickly. As the incarnation of a demon lord, he knew very well what the plane's origin core meant. Compared to the possible effects he might suffer now, he was more worried about whether the will of the abyss would take its anger out on him in the future. Therefore, he was very anxious, like an ant on a hot pan. And he was definitely not the only ant like this in the acid fog canyon. What's going on? A surge of power came from the depths of the earth. The true body of the tyrant worm had no choice but to burrow out from the soil that was squeezing it. All of the demon worms became very frightened. They could feel that a fatal disaster had quietly descended upon them. Asterisk creak. Asterisk the orifices that were emitting sulfuric acid gas seemed to have gone mad as they sprayed poisonous gas outwards. The ground began to crack rapidly. The lava that had been hidden deep underground began to churn and converge on the surface. From time to time, it would gush out from the weak spots. The entire acid fog canyon seemed to have turned into an iron pot that had been burned red. Everywhere was boiling and scorching hot. Chapter 534. The acid fog canyon was in a mess. Due to the gradual destruction of the plane's core, all the forces were in a mess. Among them, the most vexed was of course the tyrant worm. After all, he was the master of this plane in name. Stim, the huge worm, crawled out of the cave tunnel. Not long after the mutation, he immediately took a shortcut back to the broken canyon. The tyrant worm's true body was swollen, emitting a dangerous, acidic, poisonous fog. A long tongue extended from its circular mouthpart. The incarnation that had fallen in the ashes plain had regenerated on the tip of its tongue. At this moment, it was constantly roaring and questioning. Shut your mouth, damned worm. Buffett was also irritated. He slammed his machete on the ground, letting out a deafening roar. Symbol of death. The tyrant worm, who had long been enraged, no longer had any scruples. He directly launched an attack on Buffett. After consuming the spell energy stored in one link, a powerful legendary necromancy spell was instantly formed and shot out. Endless hatred, coupled with the determination to kill the opponent, the two complemented each other to ensure the success of this spell. Due to the close distance and the fact that he was not prepared for the opponent's sudden attack, the Tyrant King was unfortunately hit by the spell. However, with the strong body and soul of the Demon Lord's incarnation, even if the symbol of death was a legendary spell, it was still unable to kill him directly. At most, he would feel intense pain. In addition, he was unusually angry. This lowly worm actually dared to sneak attack a powerful Demon Lord. In the acid fog canyon plain, Buffett's face had been repeatedly slapped swollen. The spell had an effect, but it did not achieve its goal. The Tyrant King immediately recovered from the state of being attacked. You're looking for death. Buffett roared angrily. He picked up the machete in his hand and was about to slash at the tyrant worm. He was obviously not going to show any mercy. When the conflict between the bosses broke out, their subordinates naturally would not stay there foolishly and pretend that nothing had happened. The half-demon minotaurs seemed to have contracted mad cow disease. Their muscles bulged, and their eyes turned crimson. They drew their weapons and charged at the worms nearby. The latter's reaction wasn't any worse, especially the cataclysmic worms. As the children of the tyrant worm, they could empathize with their creator's anger. It seemed that the two sides were about to erupt into a fierce battle. The all-out battle that wasn't rare in the demon army was about to take place. Enough, you two idiots. At some point, the short dwarf god suddenly appeared between Buffett and the tyrant worm, who were in the middle of their battle. Although his face was pale, he still successfully controlled the two demon lords and forcibly stopped their conflict. Stim used his left hand to hold Buffett's machete, while his right hand summoned a pale golden barrier, isolating the huge body of the tyrant worm on the other side. Now is not the time for internal strife. If you don't start saving yourselves, do you too want to personally bear the wrath of the will of the abyss? Although his voice wasn't loud, when it reached the ears of the two demon lords, it was no less than a sudden clap of thunder. Seeing that they didn't intend to continue fighting for the time being, Stim secretly breathed a sigh of relief. He wasn't good at fighting. Not long ago, because the plane source core in the acid fog canyon was damaged, it caused him to suffer a lot of impact. He hadn't fully recovered yet. Just now, when he forcibly stopped the two demon lords, it seemed easy, but in fact, only he knew how much divine power he had consumed. The plane source core is damaged, but it's not completely destroyed. Don't interrupt. Now, listen. 2. What? 2. Say. 2. Finish. Seeing that Helmet, who was on the tip of the tyrant worm's tongue, was about to open his mouth to ask, Stim mercilessly interrupted his thoughts. I will release part of my authority, and at the same time, guard against any external enemies that might descend upon the acid fog canyon. If you don't want to face the enraged will of the abyss, then you, the tyrant worm, will have to personally go to the depths of the plane and deal with the curse on the plane source core. After saying this, he turned his head to look at Buffett. And you, the Tauren King, will now send out your troops to teach the fellow who has won the title of Ultimate Overlord a lesson and get rid of the hidden dangers left in the plane of the acid fog canyon. At this moment, the god of virtual games showed his powerful ability to set up a plan. The two demon lords who had just been about to fight to the death suddenly realized that if they worked together, they would benefit from it, and if they didn't, they would suffer from it. It was very strange, but it was also very natural. After all, in the face of common pressure, this was indeed their best choice at the moment. As for what would happen after they got through this, they would talk about it later. The three of them knew very well that the alliance was only temporary, and that this kind of relationship would break down sooner or later. Each of them had their own plans in mind, and there was no need to explain things that they already knew. We'll listen to you for now, little dwarf. Although it seemed rude on the surface, Buffett was the first to express his agreement, and was half a beat faster than the dragon subbody, Emtar. Give me the authority immediately, and don't mention any damn neutral monsters again. I'm going to repair the plane source core, and then Stim interrupted him again, and the Tauren King looked on coldly from the sidelines. Your command of the army now needs to be temporarily handed over to the Tauren King. He has more experience in dealing with war, and besides, you have other things to do. The situation on the field was 3 against 2. The tyrant worm growled helplessly in a low voice and ordered the demon worms to listen to Buffett's orders for the time being. After that, he didn't look back and burrowed into a cave tunnel. He regretted coming into contact with these two fellows in the beginning, and he shouldn't have let them come at all. But it was too late now, and it was easier to invite the devil and then to send him away. After the tyrant worm left in a hurry, Buffett glanced at Stim, who was deep in thought, and the Tauren King snorted disdainfully. You should have taken the initiative to attack long ago. You thought you could control the situation, but in the end, it's just a joke. Without waiting for the dwarf god to refute, Stim didn't actually have such thoughts. Buffett used the language of the abyss to give the order to set off immediately, and then his figure gradually dissipated. It was unknown whether he was hiding or using a high-level teleportation to leave directly. Although he didn't repeat his order, the majority of demons didn't dare to ignore the orders of a demon lord. Even those demon worms who had doubts in their hearts had received the tyrant worm's instructions before, so they were very obedient. The mighty army left directly from the broken canyon, leaving behind only empty buildings and a god who was deep in thought. Chapter 535. Ding. The system has detected that the title of Final Overlord has been achieved. The available rewards are as follows. Please consider the exchange accordingly. The familiar voice sounded, causing Quest to be secretly shocked. Now that things had developed to this point, he did not expect that the god of virtual games would still open the exchange list to him, and was even prepared to fulfill the promised rewards. Might as well take a look at the rewards he gave. Who knows? I might be able to figure something out from it. If there's a problem, I might be able to make some preparations beforehand. Having made up his mind, Keys picked up the exchange list disguised as a piece of parchment and quickly browsed through the updated contents. There are a total of 5 reward options. Flag bearers may choose any 3 of them. Please consider carefully. Reward 1. All accumulated gold coins can be exchanged for a standard soul prism at a rate of 3-to-1. Reward 2. Achieving the title of Final Overlord. The faction of this plane will retaliate and provide a copy of the Acid Fog Canyon military map. Reward 3. A mildly damaged mice energy core. Do not doubt the god's sincerity. Mildly damaged indeed means that it can be repaired. Reward 4. A safe passage for retreat. Even if the Acid Fog Canyon is destroyed, you can quickly retreat to the 10,000 Abyss Plains. Reward 5. A complete divinity. After assimilation, you can become a vassal of the god of virtual games, breaking away from the ranks of mortals. After reading the introductions, Keys carefully browsed through the additional explanations before slowly closing the exchange list. What a scheming old fox. It was clear that the most valuable of the 5 rewards was the complete divinity. It was a treasure that could allow mortals to reach the heavens in a single bound. In any plane of the multiverse, such a treasure would make countless people go crazy and fight for it with all their might. However, it only took a little thought to understand that this was actually a test by Stim. A divinity that could allow mortals to become vassal of gods must have been stripped from a part of his current divine title. If he assimilated the divinity, he would definitely be under his jurisdiction. Therefore, if Keys avoided this option, it would be a clear indication that he had a conflict with Stim. In other words, it meant that he had the intention to deal with the dwarf god, and his attitude was very firm. There was no guarantee that the dwarf would not set up countermeasures. As for the 4th reward, the safe retreat to the 10,000 Abyss Plains, it was obviously an option that matched the divinity reward. The dwarf god was just telling Keys that if he became his subordinate, he had the confidence and channels to ensure that Keys could escape unscathed. Apart from that, the 2nd and 3rd rewards were also related. Stim knew that Keys had Traction Citadel, so he provided a slightly damaged mice energy core. If it was repaired and installed on Traction Citadel, it would definitely increase Keys' military strength. Moreover, he had most likely fallen out with Buffett and the Tyrant Worm, so while enhancing Keys' strength, he could also reveal the other party's military deployment through the 2nd reward. Then, it was entirely possible for Keys to restrain the 2 demon lords. At that time, even if Keys did not choose the 4th and 5th options, he could still leave calmly, leaving them to fight to the death in the Acid Fog Canyon, where the source core of the plane was damaged, to restrain each other. As for the 1st reward, not only was it not a smokescreen, it was even a booster left behind for Keys' next actions, either to stand with him or to fight the demon lords. Whether it was to ascend to godhood or to start a war, a large amount of resources were needed to support it. Without money, it would be difficult to move an inch. However, with Stim's financial support, no matter which path Keys chose, the efficiency of the operation would be greatly increased. Increased efficiency meant that time was saved, and judging from the current situation in the Acid Fog Canyon, saving time was treasuring life. The 5 options are linked together, combining probing, pushing, and even showing goodwill. The thoughts of the gods are extraordinary. However, the gods could not be omniscient and omnipotent. Although Stim's understanding of Keys was certainly not superficial, The difference in information was still unavoidable. Therefore, he did not know of the young blue dragon's ability to actively adapt, nor did he know of his true plans. Exchange Reward 1, Reward 3, Reward 5. After thinking it through, Keyes immediately picked up the exchange list, ticked the reward he urgently needed, and entered the secret imprint to confirm. As if it had been prepared long ago, the moment he finished ticking, the exchange list in the shape of a parchment began to spontaneously combust. When the ashes drifted away, the reward items were neatly stacked in front of him, and the exchange list had completely disappeared. After clearing the remaining 600,000 gold coins, Keyes obtained more than 200,000 standard units of soul prisms. This wealth seemed enormous, but it was the easiest to deal with. With a wave of his hand, the young blue dragon kept all the soul prisms into his storage space. The remaining 2 rewards, the divinity and the slightly damaged mice energy core. After thinking for a while, Keyes reached out his hand to the former. Unlike the common understanding that the divinity was shaped like a bright crystal, the divinity bestowed by Stim had the appearance of a gray stone. If it was casually thrown into a plane, it was possible that many years would pass without anyone discovering its extraordinariness. However, when Keyes's fingers came into contact with the divinity, his eyebrows furrowed tightly. However, without thinking for too long, he completely grasped it in his hand and began to chant the incantation of a spell in a low voice. Treasure Concealment Spell. This was a very obscure legendary spell recorded in the Inheritance of the Megalosaurus race. The purpose of inventing this legendary spell was only to make it convenient for those Megalosaurus who were extremely interested in their own wealth to conceal a certain treasure that they possessed. In essence, this could actually be considered a legendary sealing spell, but it was of little use in increasing one's combat strength. Even a long-lived Megalosaurus would generally not learn this spell. This was because most Megalosaurus thought in a very simple way. As long as one's strength was strong enough, one's treasure would naturally not be lost, and there was no need to use the treasure concealment spell at all. However, in line with the idea that there was no harm in having more skills, Keyes had studied this spell before, and he did not expect it to come in handy now. After the hourglass-long incantation ended, the divinity, which was originally not very conspicuous, now looked much more plain and ordinary. Whether it was distinguishing from its appearance or using ordinary detection spells, all that could be observed was just a rock. After doing all this, Keyes breathed a sigh of relief, and only then did he swallow the divinity into his stomach. That's right, Megalosaurus had a special space in their abdominal cavity for storing items, and they would temporarily store things that were too important and not too big in size. Finally, he still had one more reward to deal with. Chapter 536. Professional matters had to be dealt with by professionals. While preparing to deal with the mice energy nucleus, Keyes used magic to send a message to Shay and Snade, seeking their help. When the two of them arrived and saw the thing that Keyes had placed on the table, their gazes never left it. The mice energy nucleus was the most advanced creation of magic in the world of Toriel, and it could almost be added with the suffix one-of-kind. The world of Toriel had a god who specialized in managing magic. That existence had set up strict rules and a complex magic network. Unless one became a great arcanist, ordinary mages in that world had to go through this magic network if they wanted to cast spells. Although this arrangement by the gods had lowered the requirement of talent for the spellcaster profession, they did not need to have extraordinary intelligence. They only needed to learn and memorize, step by step, unlocking access to the magic network, and they could gradually grow into a qualified spellcaster. But this also brought about many problems, such as excessive reliance on the magic network to cast spells. There was an objective ceiling for the mage profession. And even though there was no need to pay faith to use the magic network from a certain point of view, such mages were actually very similar to priests. Of course, there were always a few people in the world who were so gifted that their talents were high enough to make the gods envious. Some mages with extraordinary intelligence gradually realized the limitations of the magic network, and through slowly fumbling, they finally succeeded in getting rid of the crutch. Without the help of the magic network, they could still cast spells. Not only were there more varieties, but the power was even more powerful. In the world of Toril, they were called arcanists, magic masters who cast spells by exploring the mysteries of the rules. Among them, the best were the great arcanists, and Elam was one of the best among these great arcanists. Elam invented the mice energy nucleus, and its function was to be compatible with the rules of the plane and then absorb magic energy from the environment. In the beginning, he had invented the mice energy core because he couldn't satisfy his need for items with constant spell effects. This great arcanist was born in the early days of the Nile era. Although the Nile people had discovered the Nile secret scroll and studied it for more than 200 years, the magic skills at that time were still very crude, especially in the creation of magic items. Even the great arcanists at that time could not bypass the support of the magic network and add permanent magic effects to their magic creations. Perhaps out of fear, the gods who had mastered the priesthood of magic set very strict rules for the creation of magic items by mortals. Every time they enchanted those magic creations, it not only required a lot of mental energy from the spellcasters, but it also affected their health. In those days, it was not difficult to recognize the arcanists who often made magic items with constant effects at a glance. Compared to their actual age, they always looked particularly old and tired. In this problem, the great arcanists at that time, but still did not have any results. Because Netheril had not discovered materials that could store magic energy in that era, they could only connect to the magic network to provide energy for their magic creations. In this way, the method of maintaining the effects of magic spells was actually to imitate how ordinary mages cast their spells. However, in order to use the magic network, ordinary mages would need to meditate every day. This was similar to how believers prayed to provide power for the gods, while mages' meditation was to pay for the cost of using the magic network. The principle of equivalent exchange was followed. If it was an ordinary mage, then there was no problem. They could use the magic network to pay with meditation every day. But the magic creations were not living people, and they could not meditate. Therefore, to connect them to the magic network, the creator of the magic creations had to pay in advance for this fee. Until Iolam changed his mind and invented the mice energy core, bypassing the authority of the magic network and successfully connecting this magical object with the origin of magic in the multiverse. Then, the mice energy core could manifest certain rules, absorb all kinds of energy in the surroundings, and then convert it into magic energy with extremely high conversion efficiency, and give it to the objects authorized by the mice energy core's owner within a certain range. By the end of the Silver Age, the mice energy core had even developed to the point where it could replace part of the magic network, allowing any mortal within a certain range to cast simple spells as long as they paid a certain amount of mental energy, thus becoming a blue-striped mage. And it was precisely because of the mice energy core that the great arcanists of Netheril were able to create the floating city, a kind of miracle, super large-scale magic creation, and become one of the few mage empires in the whole of Toril, and even in the whole multiverse. One could imagine how desperate their enemies would be when a flying city descended over their heads, and most of the people living in the city could cast spells, even if they were very rudimentary. Among the great arcanists at that time, it had become a fashionable activity to ride the floating city to descend to the lower planes, look for a weak demon lord to start a war, and then plunder the resources and wealth of that plane. Although the civilization of Netheril had basically disappeared in the long river of history, for a race with a long lifespan like the demons, the fear of being dominated by the floating city of the great arcanists was still deeply etched in their minds. Stim gave Keys such a reward because he had a sudden idea after seeing Traction City. He wanted him to quickly create a floating city and then use it to deal with Buffett's subordinates and those worms and demons. As long as these troops were restrained, Keys would be free to personally deal with the two demon lords. In this way, The final result might be biased towards the young blue dragon. In this way, not only would the two demon lords have to taste the bitter fruit of failure, but they would also most likely be held accountable by the will of the abyss. They would definitely not be able to retaliate against Stim immediately, and he would also be able to leave the acid fog canyon more safely. However, even though Quest knew of his plan, he still did not feel any resistance. Instead, it was exactly what he wanted. He also wanted to use this mice energy core to make a big fuss and become the ultimate overlord that deserved to be called the ultimate overlord. I really can't believe that apart from the treasure in Shadow City, I can still see such a well-preserved mice energy nucleus. This is the most precious treasure of the Netheril era. Looking at the magic creation in front of him, the half-lich Snade couldn't help but sigh with emotion. Shay also nodded in agreement. Chapter 537. Praise aside, Shay and Snade had no intention of treating the mice energy nucleus as an antique when they studied it. This was something that could not be helped. If they wanted to repair this legendary creation of Netheril, they had to first open it. The size of the mice energy nucleus was the same as an old-fashioned fireplace. Its appearance was like a hollow armillary sphere, wrapped in many layers of metal rings. Keys had tried it once before and found that there were no rivets or welds that could be easily opened. Forcefully breaking it open would most likely damage this legendary creation, so they could only open its shell bit by bit according to the rules. It had to be admitted that Elam, the inventor of the mice energy nucleus, was definitely a man of extraordinary talent, and his attainments in spatial geometry were profound. According to Shay's inference, the mice energy nucleus had a total of 17 layers of shells. If they wanted to open it up, they had to be put back in place correctly. This was somewhat similar to assembling a Rubik's Cube, but Keyes knew that due to the limitations of the manufacturing method, the Rubik's Cube could only be designed up to grade 9 at most. However, the mice energy nucleus had a total of 17 layers. If one's intelligence was not enough, even if they worked hard for 100 years, they might not succeed. With no other choice, Keyes and the others could only choose to cheat. Let Snade use a prophecy spell to determine whether certain key steps were correct or not. It was no exaggeration to say that even if they used a cheating method, it was still very difficult, and they almost failed at the last moment. Because Keyes' prophecy spell was somewhat unreliable, this 2-hourglass-long cheat could only be completed by Snade. Although he was a half-lich and a powerful legendary spellcaster, he had almost exhausted all his energy to persevere until the end. It's done. Keyes breathed a sigh of relief. When the last metal ring was put back in place, the internal structure of the mice energy nucleus was finally revealed. In the center of the mice energy nucleus, there was a three-dimensional network woven from thin mithril threads. As if there was no gravity, this network quietly floated in front of everyone's eyes. From Keyes' point of view, he seemed to have seen something and could not help but exclaim, "This is the spell structure of Sunburst." Shay said with some confusion, "This seems to be a magic circle that reduces the dissipation of energy. The tracker has it in his body, but it doesn't." Hearing their conversation, Snader, who had been resting on the side due to his exhaustion, also walked over and curiously looked at the mithril thread. This is a negative energy harmonization array. No, he controlled the mechanical artificial body and looked left and right. From time to time, he would squat down to check. After a while, he stopped. What a genius invention! The half-lich could not help but exclaim. Compared to Elam, my intelligence is at most a groundhog. Following his example, Keyes and Shay also looked around and finally understood why Snader sighed. It turned out that the structure they had just seen was not wrong. However, as long as one looked at it from a different angle, the structure of this mass of mithril threads was different. The three of them identified it separately and then did some calculations. This small ball of three-dimensional mithril thread actually had more than 300 types of formation structures with specific functions. According to their estimates, there should be even more structures. However, due to their lack of knowledge, they could not identify all of them. Generally speaking, A magic item only needed to be engraved with one type of formation. At most, it would be a combination of several formations. However, this mass of mithril threads in the middle of the mice energy core was composed of at least hundreds or even thousands of formations. This was no longer a technical problem. The mice energy core was more like a product of a loss. No wonder. Keys understood. The mice energy core can automatically control and absorb the free energy around it and continuously supply it to the magic items and individuals around it. It also does not need to be restricted by the gods, bypassing the weave of the world of Toril. Emotion, admiration, curiosity, all kinds of emotions were present. However, the biggest problem now was how to repair this magic item. During his observation, Keys discovered what Stim had said about the slight damage. Although mithril was very malleable and tough, after being stretched to the thickness of a spider's web, its strength was definitely not enough. After receiving a strong impact, the mithril threads could also be damaged, breaking, or bending. When he was calculating the number of formations, Keys discovered that there were a dozen or so threads that seemed to be in the wrong position. This was because the formation structure made of them was mostly problematic. However, he could not be completely sure, so he could not repair it himself. He asked Snader, who was the most knowledgeable about formations. The Demolic had actually discovered this problem as well. However, after realizing the difference between himself and Elam, he did not dare to act rashly. If he damaged the other structures, this slight damage to the mice energy core might be even more serious. Of course, it was not that there was no way. After all, there were many unreasonable spells in the multiverse. If conventional methods were not enough to repair the mice energy core, then they could try unconventional methods. For example, the spell that the pit fiends could only use once a year, the wishing spell. It seemed very feasible. Ever since Keys had found a pit fiend to help him improve the engine of Traction City, he had liked this method. Now, he had more than 20 pit fiends under his command, excluding the 13 that had died. They could use the wishing spell more than 20 times, which should be enough to repair this slight damage to the mice energy core. After all, they already had a more accurate judgment as to where the problem was with the mice energy core. There is no need to give vague orders to the pit fiends and have them make vague wishes. However, to avoid trouble, Keys would definitely not tell them what it was that they had to make a wish to repair. He chose a safer method, gathering the pit fiends in batches and ordering them to make wishes to repair the network of mithril threads. In the end, after 5 wishes, the slight damage was completely repaired. The excited Demolic ignored his mental exhaustion and forcefully used legend proficiency once to confirm that the main functions of the mice energy core had been repaired. After spending an entire day, a smile finally appeared on Keys' face. His next plan had some more assurance. Graz, ZT, Buffett, the Tyrant Worm, and that fellow who wants to destroy Acid Fog Canyon. A good show is about to begin. You better not blink. The young blue dragon calculated for a while. He did not intend to let any of these fellows go. If they wanted to play, then they would play big. None of them would have an easy time. Chapter 538. It was undoubtedly an extremely difficult task to reorganize this mixed group of demons and mortals into an orderly manner. However, the ogre Brock, who was the quartermaster, and the desert elf Brock, who was the captain of the city guards, performed commendably. They counted all the supplies in detail, especially food and drinking water, and distributed them according to the number of people. Among the mortal mercenaries, some of the high-ranking guys expressed their dissatisfaction and felt that they should get more. However, when the law enforcers sent by Brock glared at them angrily, they immediately quieted down. Compared to the mortals in the city, the group of demon soldiers outside the city was much more disciplined. Except for the commanders of the Batsu Expeditionary Legion who were forced by Keys' power, the rest of the Batsu welcomed the formation of the Legion and the return of order. Those days were simply unbearable. A certain Barb Demon Guard captain dipped some tobacco from the human skin bag he carried with him and put into the bone pipe in his mouth. A great opportunity has been wasted. Fortunately, Lord Kaz is now in charge of the situation again. Perhaps, but it would be better if his lordship didn't think so highly of those mortals, another demon who was familiar with him said. What can they do? Previously, they were only servants of the Megalosaurus. Now, we don't even know where the Megalosaurus have gone. Traction City had been moving continuously for 2 days. Along the way, they encountered many earthquakes and avoided several volcanoes that suddenly emerged. Moreover, as the earth cracked, the gas that was originally deposited underground leaked out, and the acid fog canyon became full of sour gas. Although this was not an extreme environment for the demons, the group of mortal mercenaries in the city did not have such strong tolerance. They could only rely on the spellcasters to desperately purify the air so that they did not have a large number of non-combat casualties. Therefore, after detecting the surrounding situation and finding that there was no obvious danger, Traction City finally stopped moving today. Many craftsmen wearing anti-acid amulets and pig nose-style gas masks began to work on the fortress. They had to carry out damage control. Not only did they have to add an acid-resistant coating to the fortress, but they also had to add a set of distributed air purification system that covered the entire Traction City. Originally, it was very unwise to carry out such a huge modification project at this time. However, since yesterday, for some unknown reason, the workshop area in the center of the fortress had been operating at full capacity and crazily produced all kinds of magic creations. Things like anti-acid amulets and pig nose-style gas masks were child's play. Many engineering constructs and even combat models of golems began to come off the production line frequently. Look, those Megalosaurus. The two demons who were chatting just now suddenly looked up and saw figures appearing in the distant sky. With their excellent eyesight, they quickly recognized that it was actually a group of flying Megalosaurus. But what surprised them was that the alarm bell in the city didn't ring for a long time, as though they weren't worried about the possible appearance of the enemy. That was indeed the case, because the arrival of the dragons was part of Quest's plan. He had already informed Kryphia that they should gather all their forces in one place and prepare to deal with the counterattack that the two demon lords could launch at any time. Moreover, after learning that the plane source core was damaged, Kryphia had already guessed that there was a high probability that the Penishade Dragon Queen had done it. Even if Tiamat didn't do it herself, it was definitely related to her. As the third generation of a god, she had a deep understanding of that person's craziness. She was very clear about that person's character. If he could achieve his goal, he wouldn't feel any heartache at all, even if he had to sacrifice his bloodline descendant. She, who was out of her wits, could only rely on herself now. Allying with Keys was Kryphia's best choice. In particular, the other party had also promised that as long as she could complete the task of gathering the Megalosaurus army, he would send her out of the acid fog canyon as a last resort so that Kryphia's debt wouldn't become a dead debt. She was meat on the chopping block. Kryphia had no other choice now. She could only place her hopes on the young blue dragon. She hoped that he would keep his promise due to his nature of order. Apart from that, her only thought was to end the upcoming battle as soon as possible. After all, she had waited for too long. She was afraid that there would be other unforeseen events. Don't be impatient. Standing on the balcony of the audience room, Key sent a message to Kryphia to calm her down as he looked at the dragons that had landed around New Boom Town. The demons will appear tomorrow at the latest, no more than 15 hourglasses at the earliest. As long as you lead the dragons to join the battlefield when needed and help me secure victory, I will definitely fulfill my previous promise. I promise. I hope so. Kryphia's reply was very simple. She also had many things to do now. The most important thing was to fill the stomachs of the Penishade Megalosaurus. After all, the war was about to begin. An excellent general would not let his soldiers go hungry at this time. Moreover, after the upcoming war, New Boom Town did not need to worry about logistics anymore. Therefore, Keys opened up his supply to the dragons. Of course, the food, the energy bricks made from the flesh of the acid mistworms and rich in protein, was definitely not that delicious by the standards of the Megalosaurus. but it won in large quantities. It would not be a problem for the dragons to eat it for an entire day. However, apart from the white dragons, most of the megalosaurus would stop eating after they were full. They would not let their stomachs swell into a ball. Similar to the megalosaurus, before the war, the mortal mercenaries of New Boomtown also enjoyed luxurious supplies and a long period of rest. Except for the most stubborn laborers in the labor camps, they would be squeezed dry of the last bit of their remaining value and undertake work several times more arduous than before. After their deaths, they would be made into soul prisms to make a final contribution to Keys's pockets. Now, the entire Traction City was in a state of relaxation on the outside, but tension on the inside. Only Keys was nervously assigning tasks to the former general's bateau. But to them, this situation was not unfamiliar. After all, many of them were veterans who had experienced several bloody battles and were actually quite knowledgeable about fighting demons. Lord Kays, a demon general with scars all over his body, listened to the young blue dragon's military deployment. After thinking for a while, he asked doubtfully, "Why don't you let those mortal mercenaries be cannon fodder first? After all, even if they are expendable, those low-level bots of brats are much more valuable than them." Chapter 539. Faced with the demon general's question, Keys only replied with one sentence: "Complete my orders or die." To Batsu, this kind of answer was not unfamiliar. Even the demon general had once been a small soldier. Moreover, the long years of war had made these guys' tactical abilities very outstanding, so Keys did not need to waste his breath. The tense and concise meeting lasted for half an hourglass before it ended. The demon generals hurriedly left. They would use their own methods to mobilize their subordinates before the war. In this regard, Quest didn't say anything more. After all, he had other things to do. The young blue dragon came to the workshop of the golems. It seemed like the production line had just been completed yesterday. But in fact, when the Bator Expeditionary Army was first recruited, this workshop had already started to carry out various preparations in accordance with the 007 model. The resources obtained from the other Bator fortresses were mostly used in this workshop. Almost all the mages in New Boomtown had participated in the work here. In order to increase work efficiency, all their spell slots would be filled with the same type of spell. Spells such as Instruction Spell, Construct Body, and Create Secondary Elemental Essence were all cast by mid-level and low-level mages, while spells such as Limited Wish Spell and Transform All Things were given to high-level mages to complete. Originally, Keys had planned to have him and Snade cast spells together at the last moment, casting the Activate Body Construct spell on all the semi-finished golems, thus summoning a large enough golem army at once. However, with the Mice Energy Nucleus, they did not need to waste this part of the power. They only needed to add a process at the end of the production line, which was to engrave the Activate Body Construct magic circle on the golems. As long as they were within the radiation range of the Mice Energy Nucleus, the golems engraved with the magic circle would be able to operate normally. The only downside was that the range of attack of the golems was reduced, and they could not cross the boundary of the radiation range of the Mice Energy Nucleus. Otherwise, it would only take a very short time for them to turn back into semi-finished golems, and there would be no way for them to pose any threat to the enemy. However, the golems were originally a type of defensive construct. In Keys' strategy, they were mainly used for defense and counterattack. As long as they could withstand the demon army's frontal assault, these golems would not fail their mission. We mainly make flesh golems, clay golems, and iron golems here. Since Shay was busy renovating Traction City, Snade took charge of the golem workshop and introduced it to Keys. In addition, there are 10 clockwork golems with higher intelligence. Thanks to Mr. Shay's help, he compiled a command program for them. They are responsible for commanding the surrounding golems according to the actual situation on the battlefield. After hearing Snade's introduction, Keys nodded with satisfaction. According to the previous report, the golem workshop had already produced about 3,000 golems. In the next 10 hourglasses, there would be another 1,000 or so golems coming off the production line. Even after the battle, as long as Traction City did not fall, the Golem Workshop could still produce and repair golems for at least 2 days. When the Golem Workshop was first built, due to the limitations of materials and resources, Keyes and Sneyd originally intended to produce dozens of high-level steel golems, or more high-end adamantine golems, or mithril golems, to supplement the combat power of New Boomtown. However, after collecting a large amount of materials from the Bateau Expeditionary Army and obtaining the Mice Energy Nucleus, he decisively changed his mind and began to mass-produce flesh golems, clay golems, and iron golems. He was ready to win by quantity. Due to Sneyd's traditional craftsmanship and relatively low manufacturing costs, the flesh and blood golems were still the ones that came out of the Golem Workshop the most. These golems were about 8 feet tall, 5 meters, and weighed about 500 pounds, 450 pounds. As the name implied, they were assembled from corpses that had not yet fully decomposed. Each flesh golem required at least 6 corpses, some special ointment, thick ropes, and metal nails to stitch up the corpses, as well as bandages to reinforce the stitch parts. The corpses of the flesh golems were made from the corpses of the villains who had died in the penal camps, so the cost was almost zero. Keyes looked carefully and found a few familiar faces. For example, the wild boar man Roadhog, who had colluded with foreign enemies, had been made into a flesh golem with a relatively large body. Also, Sneyd said that because the brain of that guy was fresh and had a strong desire to survive, as well as good luck, the flesh and blood demon golem with Road Bully as its main body retained part of its intelligence and could use some of its combat skills when it was alive. Is it possible that they will betray us at the last minute? Keyes could not help but ask. He did not want to see any uncontrollable situation because it was more troublesome to deal with such problems on the battlefield. Apparently, Sneyd had been prepared for this and answered methodically. In fact, after entering a battle, flesh golems may go berserk and attack nearby living creatures indiscriminately. However, like all golems, flesh golems are also immune to control and illusion spells, so the enemy cannot use this to affect them. Fire and cold spells are effective, but except for some particularly powerful spells, other spells can only slow down their movements. As for the electric shock spell, it was a great tonic for the flesh and blood demon golems. Not only could it heal their injuries, but it could also increase their speed. The clockwork golems were equipped with small taser guns, which could fire electric shocks similar to the effect of static shock. As long as the flesh golems showed signs of going berserk or rebelling, they would shoot them with the taser guns. This had already been written into the command program of the clockwork golems by Shay. After being electrocuted, the flesh golems could not turn around at all. They could only speed up and charge into the ranks of the demon army. At that time, even if they go berserk, it will only be beneficial to us. Anyway, flesh golems are just consumables, and they can kill and injure the demon army. You should have noticed that I also added a lot of spikes to their fists to make them more deadly when they go berserk. After hearing Sneyd's explanation, Keyes felt that there was nothing wrong with it. He walked to the flesh golem with Roadhog as its main body and patted its arm. It's up to you on the battlefield. Let's see how you can help the enemy this time. Ha ha ha. Chapter 540. Good times were always short, even if there was seaweed to eat. Moreover, New Boomtown did not have such food rations. Although Brew had sent a lot of soft-fried acid mistworms, barbecue, honey bread, and jam, Jason still distributed these high-end food to his subordinates, the mercenaries who had converted to the path of the sacred samurai under his influence. He just took a protein brick, dipped it in a plate of salt, and drank light beer. He chewed the food in small bites, and then slowly swallowed it into his stomach. The experience of participating in the bloody battle in the bottomless abyss had changed him a lot. From the initial confusion and bewilderment of destroying more demons, Jason's belief had changed to being responsible to his companions. Objectively speaking, Keyes and his other companions did not belong to the good camp. But Jason found that not only was he not betrayed by the power of virtue, but the surging holy power in his body clearly told him that the power of virtue approved of his actions. So he was very calm. But now the environment outside New Boomtown was completely different from the sacred samurai state of mind. The raging storm was still blowing, and the sound of the wind was getting louder and louder. On the upper level of the city, a few empty houses were blown down, and some houses even lost their roofs. Two of Shay's workers ventured out to nail a loose deck on the city wall at the front of the city, but they were blown up into the sky together with the deck. Fortunately, they were dragged by safety ropes like heavy kites. After the tireless efforts of a few blood-armored demons, they were finally dragged back to the air raid shelter on the city wall. A few bruises and exhaustion caused by the secretion of adrenaline were not fatal. Because of the storm outside, the core area of Traction City became busier. It was located above the intestine of the city. The thundering roar of engines reverberated. Smoke and steam made the place hazy. Railroad tracks and elevator shafts crisscrossed the place. Hurry up and increase the pressure on the third auxiliary gate. We must keep the wind facing the same direction as the storm. Shay, who was in charge of controlling the core area, ordered loudly. At the same time, he silently cursed the sudden gust of wind. When the inclination angle reaches 13 degrees, immediately lower the 8 supports on the base. Following his orders, Traction City began to rotate on the spot. The high-pressure steam ejected from the booster port provided additional vectors for this mobile stronghold, while the 8 support frames lowered from the base penetrated deep into the ground to maintain stability. Thanks to his calm command, the huge Traction City was not blown away by the strong winds. As for the Devil Army gathered outside the city, they had an artificial safe haven because of the Traction City in front of them. They didn't need to expend more energy to maintain their defensive spells. And this point was actually very crucial. Half an hourglass ago, although the earthquakes and volcanic eruptions in the acid fog canyon plain were still ongoing, the new boomtown was actually not too affected. All the soldiers were eating and sleeping as usual. The sudden gust of wind was out of everyone's expectations. It was almost certain that this storm had something to do with the demon army. They might have been waiting for the storm to exhaust the Bartho Expeditionary Army so that they could take the opportunity to launch an attack. But in fact, the demon army had no such intention. It was because their commander couldn't wait any longer, and the half-demons, minotaurs, and worm demons were the same. Therefore, the whistling wind carried their exuberant anger as they galloped in the direction of Traction City. Enemy detected. Confirmed to be the demon army. Confirmed to be the demon army. Distance 10 parsands from Traction City. Received. Please return. The clockwork scout hidden in the soil was ruthlessly crushed by a huge ox hoof that fell from the sky. Its spider-like body exploded in an instant, and all kinds of parts shot out. After the electric current broke the circuit, there was a hissing sound as if it was describing the enemy that had just been discovered. The giant ox demon snorted and continued to walk alone in the violent wind. As the vanguard of the demon army, they had to rely on their eyes that could see through traps and invisible targets for the following troops to find and clean up these small eyes. At this time, the giant ox demon wanted to raise its head and shout, but it had to obey the silent command given by its creator. The desire for the upcoming battle, as well as the fear of Lord Buffett, made it feel tormented, and its rationality was about to be eroded. However, what he didn't know was that there was another eye around him. It was the ruby eyeball that the clockwork scout had shot out earlier. It was scattered in a cluster of snake trees and quietly recorded his image. Then, it used the remaining energy in the eyeball to send out an encrypted radio wave. "It's Buffett," Key said in a deep voice as he sat in the audience room with his hands on the table and looked at the image projected on the crystal screen in front of him. "Everyone, prepare for battle. Inform Snade to prepare to let the road robbers out of their cages to receive the guests." The alarm bell in New Boom Town began to ring. Along the brass sound transmission pipes, 4 long and 3 short bell rings were transmitted to every unit. Whether it was the technicians in the core area, the laborers suffering in the intestines of the city, or the mercenaries from the other planes who were ready for battle, everyone knew that a great battle was about to begin. However, the demon's army reacted the fastest. The Batsid demons were known for their strict discipline, and their reaction after receiving the enemy's information showed this point incisively and vividly. Without any superfluous words, all the demons silently arrived at their posts. The wind has weakened. The distance is less than 3 parsangs. Keyes immediately ordered Shay, who was operating Traction City, after summing up the real-time data and calculating in his mind. Adjust the air pressure at the gate. The first batch of the Golem army will be launched. 10-9. The reason why Keyes needed to inform Shay in advance was that this launch was not as simple as opening the gate of Traction City and releasing the golems to fight. Instead, it was in the form of a human cannon, using steam catapults to launch the golems to the target location. Most of the golems selected as the first batch to enter the battlefield were made of flesh and blood. They were placed in sealed crates filled with withered grass. Then, they were propelled by the exhaust gas from the engine of Traction City's core. With a muffled bang, they suddenly shot out. In the first batch, a total of 500 golems were selected. As if a string of firecrackers had been set off, crates of the same size flew into the sky one after another, and then fell rapidly. The giant bull demons that Buffett had arranged to be in the vanguard position, as well as the worm demons that followed behind the giant bull demons, heard the sounds of the golems being released from Traction City. At the same time, they also saw the crates falling from the sky. Many of the demons had doubts in their hearts. What's that? Chapter 541. As long as one breathed in a wisp of the acidic dust, it would feel as if a file had been placed in one's throat, causing them to spit out large amounts of bloody, frothy sputum. Fortunately, Roadhog was no longer a wild boar-man barbarian warrior. Now it was a flesh and blood golem. It had flesh and blood, but it didn't need to breathe. The pain of breathing was already far away from it. Russell, Roadhog shook off the withered grass and cork on its body and stood up straight from the broken crate. Around it, many flesh and blood golems were doing the same thing. The flesh and blood golems were similar to the slightly smaller mountain giants, but their skin was sickly green or yellowish-brown, which was a thick shell formed after the skin of the corpses had been dissolved by a special ointment. Before being released, the flesh and blood golems had been implanted with the command to attack the demons. Therefore, after climbing out of the broken crate, they began to search for the demons. The flesh and blood golems that flew further away found the advancing worm demons and rushed toward them without thinking. Those that landed closer naturally pounced on the giant bull demons. Roadhog belonged to the latter group. His target was a giant bull demon. After seeing his target, he didn't evaluate the difference in strength and size between them. Instead, he revealed his habitual hideous smile. His huge feet stepped on the soft and dry ground of the acid fog canyon, producing dull footsteps. As he stepped forward, the iron ring on his neck began to emit crackling static electricity. As the first batch of golems to be released, since there were no clockwork golems to supervise them, they could only use the simplest restraining measures. Snader put an iron collar on each of the flesh and blood golems, on which was engraved an electrostatic tremor magic circle. As long as they carried out the command to attack the demons, the collar would constantly emit static electricity within the radiation range of the mice energy nucleus. Stimulated by the static electricity, all the flesh and blood golems, including Roadhog, became faster and faster. They no longer staggered as they had when they first landed. Instead, they became more agile. Annoying undead. The giant bull demon Learbin's nose twitched. He smelled the scent of corpses coming from the hill giants that were charging at him, so he mistook the flesh golems as undead. Unlike mortals, demons were not afraid of the undead at all, unless they were especially powerful and limited. Many demons had mastered the technique of berating the undead, and they would occasionally subdue some undead for their own use. However, Lurbin didn't know how to cast spells. Or rather, giant bull demons generally disdained to learn spells other than spells. With their huge size and unrivaled strength, they had a better choice to deal with the undead creatures. Stomp. Lurbin stomped his foot on the ground, and an irresistible force was transmitted into the ground through his hooves. With him as the center within a radius of about 80 feet, the ground began to crack and tremble violently. Many flesh and blood golems that were charging at him lost their balance due to the sudden earthquake and fell to the ground. They tried to stand up, but no matter how hard they tried, they still couldn't move. However, Roadhog didn't fall because it used its own method to maintain its balance. The moment Lurbin stomped his foot, Roadhog threw out the hook on its broken arm and hooked onto the giant bull demon's navel. As if it was still angry, Roadhog took advantage of Lurbin's pain and pulled back the hook on its broken arm. Then, Roadhog threw itself at the giant bull demon's body. "You're courting death." Feeling the pain, Lurbin became even more ferocious. He reached out his hand and pulled off the hook on his navel. He exerted strength with one arm, and the speed at which Roadhog flew towards him increased by a few notches. Then, he clenched his other fist and prepared to give Roadhog a head-on punch. However, Roadhog, who was flying in the air, didn't panic in the face of danger. Under the continuous static tremor, Roadhog's agility had reached the maximum threshold that its body could withstand. It was precisely because of this that Roadhog could complete the movement of twisting its waist in the air. Not only did it dodge Lurbin's heavy punch by a hair's breadth, but also took the opportunity to step on Lurbin's arm and threw itself at the giant bull demon's shocked face like an arrow released from a bow. Splat! The double-edged dagger stabbed into the bull demon's eye. A cruel and ferocious expression appeared on the Roadhog's face. It pushed the dagger deeper into the bull demon's eye and then pulled it out with all its might. Using the dagger and the iron nail that was embedded in its arm, it pulled Lurbin's eyeball out. Crack! The giant bull demon was also extremely domineering. It didn't even cry out in pain when its eyeballs were pulled out. Instead, it opened its mouth and bit down on the road tyrant's fat body, trying to tear it apart. Although the flesh and blood golem had a layer of tough skin, it wasn't a high-quality product after all. It wasn't as indestructible as the adamantine golems and mithril golems. Under the giant bull demon's all-out attack, a small portion of the Roadhog's body was torn off with a single bite. However, something that the giant bull demon would never forget happened. This flesh golem that looked like an undead actually had the liquefied gas of the stinky cloud spell sealed in its body. The stench that went straight to the top of Lurbin's head made him feel as if he had sucked the blood of a Hezru. He immediately vomited. This also gave the other flesh and blood golems, not the Roadhog, because it had indeed lost most of its flesh and blood. It was so badly injured that it could not stand up again. The earthquake caused by Lurbin had disappeared. They all rushed over and began to attack the giant bull demon, who was vomiting on the ground. Looking at the other flesh golems carrying out their atrocities, Roadhog's face once again showed a rather personal expression. It was a little envious of the other flesh golems. Therefore, this eccentric and crazy guy actually used the hook to wedge himself into the ground and slowly drag himself to Lurbin. "I can beat you down by myself," Roadhog yelled crazily as it used its hook to hit the iron collar on its neck. "Then, I'll send you on your way." An octopus-like tentacle stretched out from the outside of the collar, then quickly pierced into its neck and connected to the wires buried inside. Bang! Chapter 542. An explosion suddenly occurred. Electric sparks traveled along the connected wires and detonated the brick explosives on the body of the Roadhog. The entire flesh and blood demon golem was burned to ashes in the loud explosion. The giant bull, Devil Learbender, naturally suffered another fierce blow. Of course, this level of explosion still couldn't kill the strong giant bull demon. The impact of the explosion also squeezed his chest and abdomen, which accelerated his vomiting of the liquefied, stinky cloud spell. He was finally able to use his spell-like ability. Many creatures in the lower world had the ability to regenerate, but it was very rare to see a creature like the giant bull demon who could use high-speed regeneration as a spell-like ability. However, from this point, it could be seen how extraordinary their high-speed regeneration ability was. Calming himself down, Lurban activated high-speed regeneration, and the wounds inside and outside of his body began to heal quickly. According to his own estimation, it would take him at most 60 breaths to heal all the wounds on his body without leaving any hidden dangers. "You damn minced meat," before he could finish his trash talk, something terrifying happened. The iron collars on the necks of the flesh and blood demon golems that were besieging him suddenly flashed with bright electric sparks. After a series of crackling sounds, they all followed in the footsteps of the roadhog. No, the blazing flames engulfed the giant bull demon, and the shockwave tore his body apart. The demon that was as tall as a 10-story building instantly withered. Even if he had the ability of high-speed regeneration, he still couldn't save his shattered body, let alone save his own life. Including that roadhog, a total of 6 flesh demon golems started the self-destruct program, and they worked together to kill a giant bull demon. Sitting in the audience room, Quest looked at the crystal screen on the desk, which displayed the real-time, synchronized data projected by Snade. If you want to create and tame a giant bull demon, after converting the resources required, you can create 3,000 flesh demon golems. So, the loss ratio between us and the demon army is about 1:500. 1:500. This loss ratio was already very low. If the cost of creating the giant bull demon was included, the loss ratio would be even lower. However, after seeing the result, Keyes and Snade were not blindly optimistic, at least not for now. This was because they knew very well that the Abyss never lacked demons. In a blood war, if the demons wanted to gain a partial advantage, they had to ensure that their losses were less than 100. However, this was a requirement for the high morale and strict discipline of the Batsu elite army. Moreover, it was based on the perfect logistical support provided by the 9 prisons of Bader. With the motley crew that Keyes had gathered, as well as the limited war resources, if he wanted to win this war in a short period of time, the casualty ratio would be at least 1:300. At the same time, there was another factor that needed to be considered. Although the magic golems were fearless, the Batsu and mortal mercenaries might not be able to do the same. Therefore, on the local battlefield, there is a lot of exaggeration in this impressive number of 1:500. If they could not increase their killing efficiency and compete with the demons, Keyes' army might not be able to hold on, and it would be difficult to secure the final victory. Prepare to release the second batch of magic golems. At least 1 clockwork magic golem will be needed as a commander. Increase the power of the steam ejection device. We must send those magic golems to the demon army. At the same time, let the Megalosaurus army prepare to attack. The giant bull demons will be left to them. After quickly cleaning them up, let the dragons quickly retreat to Traction City. After thinking for a while, Keyes immediately issued a new order. The situation on the battlefield was constantly changing. He could only rely on his intuition and experience to quickly make judgments, and then continue to make mistakes. From Keyes' point of view, Buffett sent the giant bull demons as the vanguard. He obviously wanted to make use of the individual advantage of these giant demons and let them be the arrowhead of the demon army's infiltration tactics. Therefore, Keyes chose to use the flexible defense tactic, using the dragons that had both mobility and individual strength to clean up this group of giant bull demons. In addition, if the demon army wanted to use the infiltration tactics, in addition to the necessary arrowhead, they would definitely have to deploy a large number of troops on the flanks as support. According to the experience of the demons for millions of years, even if demons were chaotic and disorderly creatures, as long as there was a demon lord overseeing them, they would still have some wisdom most of the time. They would not use the extremely stupid tactic of adding fuel to the fire, just because they had the advantage in numbers. Therefore, after arranging for the dragons to carry out the flexible defense, Keyes immediately issued another order. Notify the artillery positions on Traction City and have all the cannoneers immediately load ammunition. Ensure that the 3,200 Hellscream cannons can suppress the barrage at least twice. The estimated impact point is set to be the first area, and the ammunition will be special cannonballs filled with silver powder. With the implementation of the order, the entire Traction City became busy. A large number of laborers were driven to the front lines by the Bone Demon supervisors. With the help of the engineering constructs, they quickly transferred the Hellscream cannonballs from the ammunition depot to the artillery positions on the city wall. At the same time, Shay, who was in the core engine area, also personally operated the steam ejection device. After raising the pressure by 2 standard units, he released the second batch of golems. One of the crates was particularly large because it contained a clockwork magic golem as well as some matching combat modules. The crate fell to the ground, and after a dull thud, it turned into fragments. This clockwork golem was vaguely recognizable as a human. It suddenly came to life, emitting an ear-piercing spinning sound and the clicking sound caused by hundreds of gears turning. It had thick lower limbs, and its feet were equipped with metal claws to ensure that it could grab the ground. At the end of its 2 arms were 2 huge fists, and there were also gauntlets on them that were obviously not just for decorative purposes, making them appear even heavier. On the surface of its body, there were many gaps, and looking from the outside, one could see a large number of rotating saw teeth and spokes. If caught by the clockwork golem, these saw teeth and spokes would immediately extend and forcibly twist the opponent into paste. When this huge monster appeared, a small commotion broke out in the demon army. Many worm demons who thought they were strong began to charge at it, wanting to use violent means to forcibly dismantle this annoying construct. Facing the impulsive demons, the clockwork golem that was implanted with a combat program immediately switched to a form suitable for combat. 2 huge fists reached down and grabbed the barrels of 2 Hellscream cannons, one on the left and one on the right, easily holding them in their hands. Authorized to fire. Chapter 543. With the Mice Energy Core, the greatest benefit was that it was much easier to enchant objects. As long as the spell was not too advanced, within the radiation range of the Mice Energy Core, it would still be effective even if the formation was drawn on something that was not suitable for enchantment. Now, there were 3 small formations on the inner walls of the 2 barrels of Hellscream in the hands of the clockwork golem. 2 of them were temporary magic pockets, and the other one was an electric trap that had been weakened by a lot. The 2 magic pockets, one at the front and one at the back, would open every 5 breaths. They were responsible for filling the cannon powder and the warhead, respectively. Then, the cannon powder would be ignited by electric sparks and complete the firing action. Bang! Bang! After 2 consecutive gunshots, a large amount of iron sand flew out of the 2 barrels. These iron sand had been specially processed and plated with a layer of silver on the outside. It was quite lethal to the demons of the lower realm, and the demons that usually did not have any armor hated it even more. The barrage of bullets stuck to the worm demons that were charging over. Those with slightly weaker physiques were directly turned into sieves and fell to the ground. Those with better physiques were not directly put down, but they also let out miserable howls and stopped their charging steps one after another. Of course, there were also those who were more stubborn, such as a simple-looking Hezru. Strictly speaking, Hezru that were parasitized by the acid mist worms were not real Hezru. They were actually worm demons now. According to the imagination of the worm tyrant, the acid mist worms it created had a parasitic possession ability. They could corrode the host's body and eventually forcibly occupy it. In this process, the host's various attributes would be weakened to varying degrees, and even part of their innate spell-like abilities would be lost. However, when the acid mist worms succeeded in possession, the host would completely become a worm demon. Other than losing their spell-like abilities, their other attributes would slowly recover as the worm demons devoured each other. Moreover, since other worm demons also inherited part of their host's spell-like abilities, after devouring a large number of worm demons of other species, there was a high probability that the worm demons would also inherit part of their host's spell-like abilities. Therefore, if one wanted to deal with the demon worm, knowing only certain demonic knowledge was not enough. Although they looked like some kind of demons, they could release another kind of spell that only demons could master at any time. The Hezru that was shot by the clockwork golem at close range had lost its ability to fight back because it had the giant bull demon's super regeneration ability. In fact, although the silver-plated iron sand was very painful when it hit the body, the wounds quickly healed. Seeing that the Hezru was still charging at it, the clockwork golem immediately changed the target of its firepower. It gathered the 2 barrels of Hellscream in one place and focused fire on the big toad. The demon seemed to have become smarter. It used its hands to protect its head, bent its body, and aimed its armored back, which was covered in wet scales, at the muzzle of the clockwork golem. Then, it charged forward ferociously without caring about anything else. On his ugly face that was covered by his palms, his insect-like eyes revealed an excited glint. He panted heavily with his mouth full of sharp teeth and stuck out his tongue from time to time. Teleportation. After suffering a few more attacks, the Hezru suddenly launched a spell-like ability as if it had already calculated in its heart. It had just been confusing the clockwork golem, trying to make it ignore its teleportation ability. Then, it would be able to go behind it and launch a terrifying and fatal surprise attack. Its thick arms were now strangling the clockwork golem's neck. The Hezru's arms swelled up, and its muscles suddenly exerted strength, intending to execute a removal decapitation on the golem's head. However, something unexpected happened. Although the clockwork golem had made some mistakes in its judgment just now, the move that was close to the attack was actually written in its combat program. Sawtooth mode. The clockwork golem opened its palms and let the 2 Hellscream fall to the ground. Its body began to transform. First, it bent its elbow joints backward and grabbed the Hezru with its 2 arms in reverse. Then, it suddenly squatted down, and its armor suddenly shrank inwards. The sawteeth in its body popped out one after another and spun crazily. Before the Hezru could escape, thousands of sawteeth tore its body apart, dissecting this fully evolved worm demon into pieces of minced meat that were only the size of a fist. Grease. After completing the dismemberment, the clockwork golem automatically activated the magic array engraved in its core in order to prevent the minced meat and bone fragments from affecting the operation of the machine. A large amount of magic grease surged out from the core of the clockwork golem, completely soaking its body. With a creaking sound and the lubrication of the grease, the clockwork golem returned to its original state at an even faster speed. It activated another magic array in its body, and flames came out layer by layer from the inside out, igniting the excess grease on its body. Standing in place, its body burning with raging flames, the clockwork golem at this time was like a god that was ready to take revenge on the demons. In fact, it was indeed doing so. It squatted down and picked up another set of weapon modules, which was a cylinder made of several staves tied together. Then, it turned its head 360 degrees to get a clear picture of the situation on the battlefield. Static tremor. In an instant, a large amount of bright electric sparks shot out from the tip of the staves in its hand. However, this was not to attack the demons, but to spur those flesh and blood golems. This was because in the presence of the clockwork golem, the task of commanding the flesh and blood golems would be completed by the former. Therefore, unlike the first batch, although the second batch of flesh and blood golems also had iron collars around their necks, these collars only had the function of guiding them to self-destruct at the end and would not continuously shock them and recharge them. At this time, the second batch of more than 500 flesh and blood golems were like reefs in the waves. They gradually gathered in one place, jointly resisting the worm demons that were constantly attacking them. Spurred by the clockwork golem, their speed instantly increased by a lot. Many flesh and blood golems that were already covered in wounds quickly scabbed over and healed after being electrocuted. Some of the flesh and blood golems that were focused on by the clockwork golems could no longer control themselves and began to launch counterattacks against the demon army. They rushed to the place where the worm demons were gathered, using their shoulders, teeth, fists, and swords tied to their hands to fiercely swing around, crazily spreading boundless anger that made the demons' scalps numb. If they encountered demons that they could not defeat and the flesh and blood golems were seriously damaged, they would launch a suicidal charge. After charging in front of the demons, they would explode into a fireball with a boom. Chapter 544. The flesh and blood golems encountered layers upon layers of obstruction from the demon army and had to stop their offensive, falling into a stalemate with the enemy. They could not continue to advance the front line, and the demons could not approach the new boomtown. Due to the continuous absorption of the mice energy nuclei, the energy index in the surrounding environment gradually decreased. So, similar to the situation on the battlefield, the originally extremely fierce wind gradually began to subside. In the confrontation on the battlefield, as the commander, Buffett did not take the lead, but chose to watch the battle from the flank. When he saw the torch-like clockwork golem and the flesh and blood golems led by it resist the demon worm army with only a few hundred people, the demon lord's originally dark face became darker. Those worms are a bunch of trash. In his plan, there were 20 Megalosaurus demons as the vanguard. Although these demon worms were not very useful, they were not a problem as a support force for surprise attacks and infiltration. As long as the Megalosaurus demons tore a hole in the enemy's front line, they could swarm in and completely tear the enemy's front line through those holes. But who would have thought that before they could get close to Traction City, the demon worm army would be blocked in place and could not move forward at all? Moreover, those demon worms seemed to only use the tactic of adding fuel to the fire. They did not have any experience in fighting on the battlefield and seemed very amateurish. I can't let the boys fight with their lives anymore. The trash can't keep up. Even if they rush over, they will only be giving the enemy a victory. After all, it was a creation that he was more satisfied with. Buffett actually favored the Megalosaurus demons very much. Moreover, these more than 20 Megalosaurus demons were a trump card in his hand for this trip to the Acid Fog Canyon. There was no need for them to be wasted here. Just now, the Tauren King saw that a Megalosaurus demon named Lurbin had died in battle. He was besieged and then killed by the opponent's suicide attack. However, Buffett had a special prediction, and Keyes had already predicted his prediction. As soon as the order to retreat was given, the Megalosaurus demons had just turned their heads, and the elastic defense of Traction City had already arrived. More than 50 Megalosaurus, whose average age was at least that of an old dragon, passed through the clouds above Traction City and suddenly launched a swift and cruel attack on the colossal bull demons that were preparing to retreat. Due to the suppression of strength and numbers, apart from an elderly black dragon whose belly was cut by the horns of the Megalosaurus, the rest of the Megalosaurus were basically unharmed. They only needed to launch a single attack to wipe out 20 Megalosaurus. Order death. Increased spell range. Rotten sack explosion. Although he didn't have the feeling of seeing his son die before him, losing a trump card still made Buffett's heart ache. The infuriated demon lord was filled with killing intent, and he did not hesitate to kill the injured black dragon. As expected, the old black dragon, who was already heavily injured, didn't even have the time to spread his wings before he lost the chance to fly. After his death, the dragon's corpse instantly rotted and then burst into a violent explosion. The other Megalosaurus fled back to the clouds. "You bunch of... Don't surround that bunch of trash." A pink acid mistworm appeared in the hand of the furious Tauren King. He ordered in exasperation, "Rely on the advantage of the Legion's numbers and advance towards that fortress immediately." After that, he was too lazy to explain anything and threw the pink acid mistworm to the ground. The strangely colored worm disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye, and after a few breaths, it appeared in the hands of a Cataclysm worm group, perfectly repeating the order. The Tauren King's abuse made the Cataclysm worm group angry, but because of the Tyrant Worm's previous instructions, they had to follow Buffett's instructions to dispatch the army. Thanks to the intervention of the Cataclysm worm group, the chaotic demon worms quickly adjusted their target. They no longer only cared about destroying the two groups of golems that had been released from Traction City. Instead, they divided a small number of troops to surround them, while the rest continued to charge in the direction of Traction City. And all of this had already been seen through by Keys. He just tapped twice on the crystal screen on the desk and gave the artillery positions on the city wall to the right to fire freely according to the original plan. In an instant, more than 3,200 Hellroars opened fire at the same time, letting out a deafening roar. They were divided into 3 rows. There were 1,200 on the wide wall at the top of the fortress, and there were 2 floors below, each with 1,000 cannons. Due to the need to consider the shooting angle of the lower 2 floors, in order to achieve a longer range, they used silver-plated projectiles that weighed about 12 pounds each. Each projectile had a wire inside it that could explode at a distance of about 1,500 yards. Because the shooting angle of the upper floor could be adjusted to about 45 degrees, and it also had the advantage of height, the range of the Hellroars was much higher than that of the lower 2 floors with the same amount of cannons. Therefore, the first shell fired by the Hellroars on this floor was the chain shell of the scattershot shells. The 2 weights of this shell were connected by a silver-plated iron chain between the 2 connecting rods. After being fired, it could rotate and cause terrible cutting damage to the enemy. The first salvo, more than 3,200 shells, poured down on the demon army at once. The demon worms that were hit by the cannons were directly beaten to a pulp. As they ran, they would find that their companions in front of them disappeared into thin air. Then, the same doubts would appear in the hearts of their companions behind them. Don't be stingy with your spell-like abilities. Hurry up and use teleportation to quickly pass through this damned area. The Cataclysm Worm group, in charge of commanding the demon worms, shouted from behind the demon army. However, their prediction was also predicted by the cannoneers of New Boomtown. Lower the shooting angle by 1 unit. Because they were immune to fire damage, the Batsu cannoneers directly operated and quickly lowered the shooting angle of the Hellroars before clearing the barrels and continuing to reload. The demon worms with teleportation had just crossed a large distance and assumed that they had already dodged the cannons. They were looking forward to rushing into New Boomtown and enjoying the slaughter while ridiculing the weak ones who didn't have the ability to teleport. However, the super rumble that had fused 3,200 rumbles sounded once again. The shells that flew out of the Hellroars once again fell on the demon worms' heads. This time, it was the guys who had teleported some distance ahead that were covered. Their ridicule now became even more sarcastic. Chapter 545. To break the stalemate on the battlefield, using cannons had always been a good method. And from the beginning of its invention, it was not only a defensive weapon, but it could also be used for offense. Start the engine, move forward at second-level speed, maintain stability. Keys continued to pay attention to the situation on the battlefield, and once again decisively issued an order. Attack together with the combat troops, rely on Traction City, kill all the demon scum that tries to rush over. If Traction City was compared to a tank, then it was much larger than the rat tank that Keys knew in his previous life. And because of the large number of cannons, this tank was also a veritable multi-turret type, coupled with its speed that was faster than a galloping horse. Only the Batsu warriors were competent enough to coordinate with it. The so-called cooperative forces referred to the Bateau Expeditionary Army that had been recruited by Quest. There was only one requirement for them. Always leave the front and the assault to Bateau City. As for the flanks, rear, underground, and even the sky, they must all watch over everything. The mission seemed a bit unreasonable, but the demons felt that the young Blue Dragon's arrangement was quite humane. In fact, throughout the history of the Blood War, the number of times that the commander of the Batsu Expeditionary Army was directly in charge of the front battle could be counted on one hand. Most of the time, the Batsu Expeditionary Army would let the small soldiers charge at the front and use them as cannon fodder. Even if they achieved a complete victory in the end, they would rarely be remembered for their achievements. One could imagine how excited the group of veterans in the lower world would be when they heard that they no longer needed to be cannon fodder. For the glory of Sir Keys. Stragglers demote. Adventurers demote. According to the division of the guard area, let the demons enter Traction City. The captain of the squad demote. All squad members will be beheaded. As the combat troops set out, thanks to the nature of the Batsu People's Order, the strict and clear military orders were quickly imprinted in the demons' minds. They did not have the courage to disagree, because mutiny would directly be demoted to inferior demons. For the demons, demotion was the most terrible punishment, and there had never been one like it. Even death could not compare to it. So in addition to being emotional, they also remained in awe and were ready to teach the demons a lesson. Slaughter the dregs of those insects. The tracks of the Traction City rotated forward, making muffled rumbling sounds. The hot steam discharged from the core engine covered the area with a layer of mist. The fighting spirit of Batsu's soldiers soared. Their battle roars resounded through the sky and even shattered the accumulated clouds. In contrast, the situation of the Devil Army was not so optimistic. The barrage of Hellscream had forcefully stopped the Fiend Worm's charge. Nearly 10,000 fiends had turned into cannon fodder in the blink of an eye. Even if the demon army was massive, and even if they were limited by the terrain, there were still millions of demons and worms participating in the battle. At the same time, the cataclysmic worms were supervising the battle from the rear. But how many more rounds of bombardment could they withstand? 30 rounds, 40 rounds, or 50 rounds? After all, the Calamity Swarm was not the Tyrant Worm. If half of the Devil Legion died, they would most likely collapse on their own. At that time, he could only let Buffett take action personally, relying on his formidable strength as a demon lord to strive to turn the tide. But would he? The acid Fog Canyon Plain was the Tyrant Worm's territory. The Tauren King had come here only for revenge. He would not consider the interests of the Fiend Worm at all. Therefore, the Calamity Swarm did not actually trust the Demon Lord. Due to the Tyrant Worm's instructions, they had to listen to his orders for the time being. Retreat. At the rear, retreat 10 miles and focus on building the Nest Fortress and Crypt defense line. Unable to withstand the pressure, the Cataclysm Swarm finally abandoned Buffett's order and issued a new order to the Demon Worms. At the front, perform the devouring ritual and create temporary acid mist giant worms to resist the attack of the fortress. According to their thinking, the Devil Legion, which had fallen into a stalemate due to the bombardment and the obstruction of the Golem army, had now become a part of the force that had to be abandoned. Instead of being wasted in vain, it was better to let them carry out the devouring ritual and fuse into the acid fogworms that had little intelligence but were powerful. They would become higher-level cannon fodder. The Fiend Worm in the rear could take this opportunity to retreat to a safer place and build a fortress defense system. When the Traction City, which had consumed part of its power, arrived, they could defend and counterattack. It was just that they had miscalculated two conditions. First, with Keyes' current resources, if he allowed the artillery position to suppress the Fiend Worm, let alone 50 rounds, even 10 rounds would be insufficient for the Traction City's reserves of ammunition. Therefore, he ordered the Traction City to launch an assault and crush the Fiend Worm instead of continuing the artillery suppression. Therefore, Keyes could not let the Devil Legion retreat. Second, the Fiend Worm was chaotic by nature. Even if the Calamity Swarm could control most of the Fiend Worm, it was still very difficult to organize this kind of tail-cutting and defensive counterattack strategy. The retreating Fiend Worm and the Fiend Worm in the front where the ritual needed to be held were now intertwined. It would take a lot of time to separate them. Therefore, when Buffett observed the Fiend Worm's movements, the Tauren King stomped his feet and cursed again. Useless fools, these worms are even stupider than ghouls. They even took the initiative to give up their advantage in numbers. If it were not for the fact that it was not a good time for internal strife, he really wanted to wipe out the Calamity Swarm. Even if it was not beneficial to the outcome of the battle, it could at least appease some of the anger in his heart. Listen to my orders. Buffett pressed his temples that were constantly swelling due to congestion. He suppressed his emotions and ordered the half-demon Tauren standing behind him. When the moving fortress is crowded with the Fiend Worm, immediately rise into the air and use teleportation spells to break into its artillery position and eliminate the firing points. The leader of the group of half-demon Taurens listened to his master's orders and immediately conveyed it to every warrior. In addition, Buffett also picked up his machete and was ready to find the right time to personally join the battle. After waiting for a moment, the group of fiend worm that was ordered to perform the devouring ritual swallowed and merged with each other. The first acid mist worm appeared on the battlefield. The giant worm was like an acid mist worm that had been magnified thousands of times. Every muscle on its body was made up of a demon worm, and thousands of twisted and struggling evil faces could be seen on its body, ready to spread pain at any time. Chapter 546. Traction's citadel tore a deep hole in the Devil Legion's front line, allowing Batsu's warriors to attack from both sides. Those high-ranked worms would occasionally launch a counterattack, but the devils dealt with them with ease. That was until the sudden appearance of the giant worms of the acid mist. These enormous worms laid across the path of the new boomtown like a continuous mountain range that was very difficult to cross. The Batsu Legion stationed on Traction Citadel naturally would not allow them to launch an attack on the fortress. The 3,200 Hellscream were all aimed at the newly appeared worms of the acid mist, constantly baptizing their bodies with cannon fire, shattering them into pieces. However, these enormous worms were like earthworms. No matter how many pieces they were cut into, each piece would always grow into a smaller derivative. Not only that, these worms were fearless. Even if they were ravaged by cannon fire, they would still continue to attack Traction Citadel. This greatly increased the pressure on the Legion of Devils, and Batsu's warriors began to suffer large losses. Purgatory Creation. Faced with an acid mist worm derivative that was charging towards him, the captain of the Barbed Devils swung his blade, stabbing it at the ring-shaped sawtooth head of the enemy. At the same time, he also used his innate ability to add the Purgatory Creation ability to his weapon. The blade pierced through the nerve center, and a large amount of body fluid began to spurt out from the triangular wound. This derivative tried to use its strong muscles to seal the wound, but it was useless. As the body fluid flowed out, it could only wither and fall to the ground. Ignite Flame. The captain of the Barbed Devils took out a badge. This was a magical creation that Keys had provided to all the captains of the Legion of Devils after mastering the Mice Energy Core. He activated the Etch spell, summoning a large amount of flames, and burned this derivative to ashes. This action seemed clean and nimble, but in fact, this was the result of his experience after paying the price of the lives of several of his subordinates. Many low-ranked devils would not be able to deal enough damage in one go against the giant acid worm spawn, so they would be able to resist with their powerful regenerative abilities. They would then be bitten by the worm's sharp teeth and die tragically from the poison. What was even more deadly was that some of the larger derivatives still had the complete body of a demon worm on them. Therefore, they were able to use certain magical abilities that were impossible to guard against. Spells like teleportation, weakening spells, vaporization, and so on, if used properly, could really catch the Legion of Devils off guard. We can't let those guys fuse into monsters anymore. Staring at the real-time battle situation on the crystal screen, Keys made up his mind. He raised his hand and tapped twice in the air, issuing the latest order. Release all the Golem Legions. The target is the fusion location of the monsters. Then, the young blue dragon in human form stood up, took the dragon head warhammer in his hand, and strode out of the door. Shay, who received the order, immediately busied himself to the point that his feet barely touched the ground. In this great battle, this remnant of the Wonder Craftsman played a huge role. If he had not personally operated it, the core engine of Traction City would not have been able to operate at such a high load. Together with the information sent by the spellcasters, Shay used the dynamic coordinate system he had established to accurately anchor the location of each devouring ritual. Then, he accurately calculated the required angle, steam pressure, and other values for the golems to be released. Under his precise control, the The golems sealed in the slatted boxes all hit the target locations without exception, delivering an unexpected gift to the demon worms. To ensure that nothing went wrong, in this batch of golem legions, in addition to the clockwork golems that were used to command the battlefield, each target location was equipped with several iron golems that were used to attack and defend. When these iron-cast robots stood, they were 4 times the height of ordinary people. When they moved, they had an unstoppable momentum. Just by walking, they would cause the earth to tremble. Each iron golem was wrapped in thick cast-iron armor, holding a great sword and a shield in its 2 hands. Since the outer shell had been engraved with magic arrays in advance, these strong golems were always surrounded by raging flames. If they were surrounded, these iron golems would also use spitting attacks in addition to physical means. Their bodies were filled with high-pressure, liquefied death cloud gas. Once the valve on the surface of their bodies was opened, the gas would escape into the surrounding air. With these war weapons that were good at attacking and defending, and with the command of the clockwork golems, as well as the cooperation of the flesh golems that were not afraid of death and dared to launch suicidal attacks at any time, the failure rate of the demon worms devouring each other and fusing into the acid mist giant worm ritual rapidly increased, greatly reducing the pressure on Traction City. Many demon worms chose to retreat. Originally, under the arrangement of the cataclysmic swarm, they retreated first to establish a defensive position at the rear, but they were attacked from behind. "Get out of the way, don't block my way. Walk. I'm afraid you're not running away." A Glabrizu and a Vrak quarreled. The Glabrizu flew into a rage out of humiliation and used its large colisserie to send the Vrak flying. Naturally, the Vrak was not to be outdone. The nails on its claws suddenly snapped and flew towards the Glabrizu. At the same time, each nail grew to more than a foot long and pierced the Vrak's body like sharp nails. The Vrak rubbed its fingers, and new nails grew from its fingertips, while the Glabrizu's wounds quickly rotted and festered. The Glabrizu cried out in pain, its eyes burning with flames, and it angrily chanted an incantation. The Vrak that was still proud of itself melted and peeled off like a candle, and its filthy feathers scattered all over the ground. Whoosh! The Glabrizu that was laughing suddenly had an arrow embedded in its majestic back muscles. Its wild laughter came to an abrupt end, and it fell to the ground. Don't waste the demon-hunting spider's venom. A certain person wrapped in an illusion cloak scolded his companions in a low voice. They all wore the same clothes, and in the eyes of the demon worms, they looked like their own kind. The Glabrizu has a permanent spell of truth. The person who obviously played with the bow explained and did not say anything else. However, this explanation was obviously effective, and the person who seemed to be the leader did not continue to scold them. He just gestured for the rest of the team to quickly follow and blend into the retreating demon worms, sneaking towards the enemy's rear. Chapter 547. There was a saying in the art of war, win by surprise. Keyes was not satisfied with defeating the demon worms in a head-on battle. He wanted to seek a greater victory. Therefore, several secret teams were activated. After careful disguises, they immediately blended into the demon army. The retreating demons provided cover for them, and the constantly advancing Traction City ensured that they were always within the radiation range of the mice energy nucleus. The magic creations on their bodies could also continue to work, covering their tracks. From the looks of it, those who carried out this mission were all members of the Mortal Mercenary team. They were all carefully selected stealth and assassination experts. At the same time, they had also undergone the training of drows, led by Snader. These people were of different races and professions. Needless to say, assassins, rogues, warriors, and so on. Many of these people were of these professions. But some teams were also equipped with mages, hidden archers, druids, or rangers. But they generally had one thing in common, which was that they were particularly good at hiding, disguising, and killing. When Traction City had just released the Golem army, it had fired many empty cannons, but those were not real empty cannons. Every time, An invisible crate with a temporary invisibility magic circle would pop out. These people were in it. Due to Shay's powerful computing ability, these teams were not released in disorder. Instead, they were grouped according to the training and landed safely at the rear of the demon army. And most of the teams moved silently without a hitch. Only a few teams were unlucky enough to encounter demon worms that might discover their whereabouts. They had no choice but to act first. It had to be admitted that their training during this period was extremely arduous. However, every drop of sweat would not let down the person who gave it all away. These members of the stealth team had now become masters of hunting demons, and the methods they used were brilliant. Coupled with a set of suitable equipment, the venom of the demon hunting spider, the matte silver powder, the weapon smeared with the essence of Chongshan, and the purr potion in the syringe, even the more powerful worm demons would not be a match for him. However, ordinary demon worms were only an appetizer. Their real mission was to sneak behind the enemy and eliminate the calamity bugs that commanded the demon worms. This was the surprise victory that Keyes wanted. He wanted to paralyze the command of the demon army through the decapitation tactic, and then carry out a large-scale siege on the demon worms gathered here. Up until now, the operation of these few stealth teams could be considered to be rather smooth. Even if some teams had some twists and turns, they quickly cleaned up the mess. The defensive counterattack position chosen by the calamity bugs was originally located 10 miles away from the main battlefield. But due to the chaotic situation, this position was pushed back by more than 10 miles. Although the distance between them had been lengthened, the stealth teams had also undergone physical training. They cooperated with the retreating worms and chased after them when they retreated quickly. When they slowed down, they relaxed their pace. In the end, with a speed that was relatively fast but didn't affect their stamina too much, they successfully sneaked to the defensive counterattack position chosen by the cataclysmic bugs. The main characters had already appeared. In order to urge the demon worms to build the nest fortress and dig the crypt defense line, the calamity bugs could be said to be worried. These guys, who were originally schizophrenic, had now completely split into many parts. They split into many groups and acted as their own representatives to command the demon worms to build a camp. In order to ensure the progress of the work, they had no choice but to split up many times. As a result, the strength of each disaster bug group that was split off was much weaker than before. Of course, the division of the calamity bugs could be reversed. As long as the construction of the camp was completed, they could reunite and restore their original strength. But the premise was that there could be no accidents. But this was a bit difficult because accidents had already come to the door, and this accident that came to the door was very difficult to deal with. Whoosh! The arrow shot into a group of calamity worms at a tricky angle. Disgusting slime burst out of the high-grade demon worm's body, but the demon worm turned a deaf ear to it. Instead, it turned the ugly face made of worms in the direction of the arrow. Interesting. Someone will attack us. Idiot, this is a sneak attack. But it's useless. We are a group of insects. As if talking to themselves, the group of calamity bugs said a lot of words, and more than one sentence was accompanied by other voices. However, none of them mentioned the injuries on his body, even though the tip of the arrow was coated with the venom of a demon-hunting spider. It's useless. The stealthy archer used ventriloquism to convey his meaning to his companions. This demon worm seems to be able to separate every part of its body. That poisoned arrow only killed one of the worms in its body. Then chop it up completely, the leader of the stealthy team said fiercely. Big guy, charge and use wind slash. Small guy, coordinate with him in the middle and find the right time to paste his face with matte silver powder. Big guy was the nickname of the warriors in the team, and small guy was a rogue. After finishing this arrangement, he also sent a message to a fallen druid who was also a spellcaster. I'll weaken the swarm of worms. You find a way to connect the worms in his body as much as possible. The reason why he was confident in defeating the group of calamity bugs was that he specialized in spells and had some experience in using curses and summoning spells. At the same time, he also had some cards up his sleeve. Even if the casting failed, he could still turn the tide in the end. That fallen druid, on the other hand, had a special liking for the plants in the abyss. During the team training, he displayed excellent field control skills. In the end, the two reached a consensus. Taking advantage of the distraction of the warriors and rogues, they began to aim at the group of calamity bugs and cast their spells. The remaining stealthy archer in the team, although he wasn't assigned a task, also began to freely attack the group of calamity bugs. With his exquisite archery skills, he didn't miss his target every time. He also avoided the warriors and rogues and accurately pierced the body of the group of calamity bugs with a small bottle of Chongshan's essence. You are wasting your strength, haha. We are a group of insects. We have the advantage in numbers. My subordinates are on their way. You are dead. All kinds of trash talk came out of the mouths of the group of calamity bugs. Some were taunts, some were threats, and they didn't stop for even a moment. It wasn't until a black ray of light shot out of the stealthy team's leader's finger and entered the group of calamity bugs that he closed his mouth and checked his body. The curse obviously had some effect. "Where's your nonsense? Why did you stop?" the fallen druid said. He even took off his hood, revealing his true appearance. "You lowly and hateful insects." He knew how to anger the group of calamity bugs and make it easier for him to cast druid spells. From now on, you can only give birth to life. Don't even think about spreading death. Acid mist worms twisted around the group of calamity bugs. The smile on his face was full of malice, and his whole body was emitting dark and filthy power. However, the fallen druid took the initiative to attack. The wooden arrow shafts on the group of calamity bugs gave him an idea. Following the completion of his incantation, the painted arrow shafts suddenly recovered and grew roots. Regardless of what the group of calamity bugs originally planned, he was forced to stop and try to pull the broken arrow out of his body again. But the druid's spell didn't just let the arrow be firmly embedded in his flesh. Instead, it made it take root and germinate, growing deeper and deeper into the wound and absorbing the demon's vitality. The group of calamity bugs' body swelled up as if it was filled with air. He shouted in anger, but not in pain, and chanted an incantation, summoning a burning flame in his palm. He then approached the growing wood, trying to use the fire to peel it off his body. But the result was even more miserable because the roots didn't seem to be carbonized after being burned by the fire. Instead, they became even crazier and kept twisting towards the group of calamity bugs. The slender but tough vines had already wrapped around each of the acid mist worms in his body and pierced them one by one. Damn it, it's Viper Vine. The former high-grade worm demon watched as tiny vines and tender green leaves grew on the surface of his body. They intertwined with each other and became thick branches, holding up a green canopy. The group of calamity bugs didn't turn into a viper vine tree. Instead, they provided the druid's creation with all kinds of nutrients necessary for growth. "My business with you will never end like this," the group of calamity bugs shouted. "Never, ever." But the fallen druid didn't waver. No matter how tenacious his opponent's will was, or how much the battle around him distracted him, he had to complete the spell. "It will," the team leader whispered, but it was more like he was talking to himself. "The chaos must be ended." The group of calamity bugs let out a final wail, and all traces on their body disappeared into the viper tree created by the druid's arrow shafts. The acid mist worms on his body became mottled and then grew into thick and hard bark. His mouth was still whimpering, and he became a lump on the bark. The roots continued to extend downwards and finally pierced into the ground, making him unable to move anymore. Seeing this, everyone left. Chapter 548. Not bad. I don't need to use my trump card. The leader of the stealth squad saw that the druid had dealt with a group of calamity bugs and immediately ordered everyone to leave. Before leaving, he took out 2 magic talismans and wanted to activate the grease and igniter rays engraved on them. But on second thought, although he was not sure whether the calamity bugs were dead or not, it was enough that he could no longer command the demon worms. There was no need to complicate things. Obviously, The leader understood the significance of his task, so he quickly repeated the same trick. He let the warriors and rogues restrain the calamity bugs, while the hidden archers were responsible for laying the groundwork. He cast curses to weaken the enemy, and finally let the druid attack the enemy. More and more calamity bugs were eliminated one after another. Compared with them, some squads took a completely different approach. For example, a stealth squad with a monk as the leader completely relied on the monk's infiltration ability to attack the calamity bugs, while the other squads cooperated to suppress them. Although the efficiency was a bit lower, it was not completely useless. At least all the stealth squads had been activated, and the calamity bugs were killed one after another. However, with the gradual completion of the task, more and more stealth squads exposed their whereabouts. The calamity bugs were not fools. They found out that someone was killing them. In less than half an hourglass, after losing more than a dozen calamity bugs in a row, the remaining calamity bugs all gathered in one place. At this time, they were no longer in the mood to manage the construction of the defensive counterattack position. Instead, they led many demon worms and began to conduct a carpet search of the stealth squads. In the end, relying on the numerical advantage of the demon army, the stealth squads were surrounded. Don't let those guys go. A first-generation calamity swarm with the bloodline of the worm tyrant looked at the stealth team that was blocked in a cave and gritted his teeth in hatred. He loudly ordered, "Charge in and tear them all to pieces." After saying that, the cruel guy pulled a demon worm beside him. It was a poor dretch, and then tore it to pieces in front of the other demon worms. Do it like this. This kind of reasonable persuasion method made all of his subordinates quiet out of fear. They obediently listened to the instruction and then rushed to the hidden team that was blocked in the cave at the fastest speed possible. In the process of running, they could not help but let out loud roars, as if venting their anger and trying to drive the fear out of their minds. Wall of fire. Seeing that the group of devil worms were about to rush into the crypt, a wall of fire appeared in front of them out of thin air. A few of the thick-skinned devil worms wanted to forcibly break through the wall of fire, summoned by the spell, but just touching the flames made them complain incessantly. It turned out that those seemingly ordinary flames didn't just cause fire damage. They actually contained a rather shocking amount of hellish energy. To demons of the chaotic evil alignment, this kind of energy was clearly more damaging than flames. Looks like it's time to reveal my trump card. As the dull voice sounded, a terrifying greater devil walked out of the crypt. This huge devil had wings like a dragon, and a thick layer of ashes and embers covered his smoldering strong body like a carapace. He was the leader of the hidden team and also a powerful burnt sacrifice demon. His identity was his biggest trump card. When he stepped on the ground, the surrounding air began to boil. The burnt sacrifice demon waved his hand, and a storm of flames engulfed the devil worms closest to him. Those miserable guys could only let out a wail before turning into ashes. Mass Char Monster. Just as the Scourge Worm group was about to command the other devil worms to surround them, the burnt sacrifice demon took the initiative to counterattack. This powerful devil only used a hand gesture to temporarily freeze those devil worms in place. The corners of his mouth cracked open as he laughed excitedly, spitting out lava-like saliva. Order exhaustion. The burnt sacrifice demon's arrogant actions just now had been a disguise. He'd used it to confuse many opponents in the past, and even the Scourge Worm group had fallen for it. He then suddenly appeared beside the Scourge Worm group that had collapsed on the ground, extending his strong arm and ruthlessly stabbing it into its body. Hellfire. Like an inflating balloon, the body of the cataclysmic worms instantly swelled up, and the evil flames containing the power of Bator roasted this demon worm from the inside out. Finally, it turned into something similar to a burnt coal ball. The burnt sacrifice demon shook his hand, allowing the charcoal to fall to the ground. At the same time, many similar scenes were playing out in the Scourge Worm group's defensive position. Powerful devils, such as the burnt sacrifice demon and pit fiends, suddenly appeared one after another, using their overwhelming strength to easily deal with the Scourge Worm group. This had been Keyes' plan all along. He'd relied on the stealth squad to assassinate and confuse the Scourgeworm group. While they were gathered together, he'd let the powerful devils of Bader's expeditionary army rise up and kill them. With this method, Keyes had finally defeated the Devil Worm's command structure. Unless the Tyrant Worm Lord descended, the Devil Worms were now like a sheet of loose sand, unable to resist the advance of Bator. The Bator generals who'd completed their mission only needed to wait in place, waiting for the main army to converge while taking care of the stealth squad at the same time. However, there were always some people who could not stand the loneliness, and the boredom of waiting made them want to do more damage. For example, they turned part of the Worm's Nest fortress and the crypt defense line into ruins that could never be repaired. After dealing with the Scourgeworm group nearby, the burnt sacrifice demon could no longer find a target. However, he suddenly felt something, causing him to raise his head to look at the sky. He saw a meteor with a trail of flames falling towards the ground. There was no doubt that this was a pit fiend using meteor burst. The meteor landed heavily on the wall of the Nest fortress, smashing through the wall made of mud and shellac. With a loud explosion, it flattened a large part of the nest. How extravagant, using meteor burst to tear it down. The burnt sacrifice demon mocked inwardly when he saw this scene. Although he couldn't stand such a wastrel act, he still had to show some appreciation. Thus, the powerful devil pursed his lips and ordered the devil worms he'd just controlled with mass charm. Get to work. Tear down the wall. Chapter 549. 8 steel legs. There were magnets on the feet. Rivets protruded from the body, covered in armor. The camera rotated and struggled to focus on the uninvited guest in front of it. Crack! A huge hoof stepped on its body and chopped it into pieces. The broken claws writhed helplessly on the ground. Then, a thin cable extending from its tail suddenly tightened and dragged it back to the ventilation pipe. Damn it! The half-demon Taran pounced on it, but it was still a step too late. The spider-like thing was quickly dragged into the ventilation pipe with a grill and then disappeared without a trace. When Keyes sent out a stealth team to kill the Scourge Swarm, many half-demon Taurens also sneaked into Traction City. They had received orders from Buffett to destroy the cannons on the mobile stronghold. However, this trick did not fool Keyes. After entering a state of war, the entire Traction City was full of Clockwork Scouts. They monitored every corner of the fortress. Knowing that their whereabouts were exposed, these half-demon Taurens no longer hid. They investigated the location of the artillery positions and used their teleportation ability to raid here. Coupled with the Taurens' never-get-lost characteristic, they did not have to worry about not being able to find the artillery positions. These guys were now completely relying on instinct and striding forward. The one leading the team was their clan's war chief, Bree the Heart Gouger. He was a warrior handpicked by Buffett, who had once pleased the absolute king of the Tauren race by killing the legendary Null Barbarian. Don't fall behind. Bree bore the brunt of the charge and walked in front of many half-demon torrents. Black smoke came out of his nostrils as if his internal organs were filled with foul gas. The half-demon Taurens, in terms of appearance, were actually very similar to Baelor demons. It was just that their bodies were much smaller and there were no burning flames on their bodies. As the latest creation of the Lord of Beasts, they were originally a group of Taurens who believed in Buffett and lived in the material plane instead of making a living in the abyss. But at that time, in order to return to the acid Fog Canyon plane, Buffett had to use the power of the Maze Path. The Demon Lord only had one Maze Path, which was the Path of Fusion that he usually used to test new Tanaree demons. When using this Maze Path, the demons would first decompose in the process of expansion and extraction, and then reassemble into a new appearance at the other end of the passage. During the experiment, if Buffett also walked into the Maze Path, then he could use his own power to control the randomly reassembled demons after decomposition and determine where they appeared and how much they reassembled. It was precisely because of such means that the Fiend Lord was able to create powerful Tana Re like ancestral Fiendbray and gigantic Bullfiend. Furthermore, he had placed them in every corner of the bottomless abyss. However, after sending his own incarnation into the maze path, the power required to use the maze path would greatly increase. If the demons were to travel with him, Buffett could only bring a few dozen demons to the acid fog canyon at most. That was why he chose the Taurens of the material plane as the first, and then arranged for 2 Baylor demons to undergo the decomposition of the maze path together. Through the maze path, they not only passed through the barriers set by Stim, but also successfully arrived at the acid fog canyon plane. After the 2 Baylor demons were decomposed and reassembled into the bodies of the Taurens, Buffett also created the half-demon Taurens, a new half-abyssal species. Of course, these half-demon Taurens absorb different amounts of Baylor essence. For example, Bree the Heart Gouger, because he was favored by Buffett, absorbed more and became more powerful. He could even use some spells of the Baylor demons, while the other half-demon Taurens were much weaker in comparison. As they walked, the group of half-demon Taurens gradually approached the artillery base of Traction City. Their noses could already smell the smell of gunpowder in the air, but suddenly, the figures of enemies appeared in the corridor in front of them. There are people blocking the way in front. Kill them. Bree, who was leading the way, roared loudly. He strode forward and took the lead to charge. The ones blocking the path of the half-demon Taurens were none other than the mortal mercenaries from another plane that Keyes had arranged in the fortress. These people were currently under the jurisdiction of Blatch. After receiving the news from the Clockwork Scouts, the Desert Elves quickly arranged people to surround the group of half-demon Taurens on the path that they had to pass through to reach the artillery position. Enemy attack. Launch a counterattack. The one who spoke was a robust man with flame-like skin. His hair was like a fluttering flame, and there were 2 short and thick mottled horns on his forehead. It was easy to tell from his appearance that he was an Ifrit, a human descendant of the fire element whose ancestor was a fire deity. Ifrit's personality was more impatient. When he saw the half-demon Taurens charging towards him, he did not retreat, but instead charged forward. He waved the 2 scimitars in his hands and rushed out, completely ignoring his companions. Swift feint. This fire element descendant was good at using scimitars, and it was obvious that he had received formal training in the City of Brass. Therefore, when he attacked, he was very disciplined. His 2 scimitars shone brightly, and when he waved them, they dazzled his opponent's eyes. It's just a flashy little trick. Faced with the scimitars that were swinging towards him, Heartgouger Bree did not have any intention of dodging. He only thrust the spear in his hand forward swiftly, his movements as fast as lightning. He was very experienced in battle, and it was easy for him to see through Ifrit's weakness. His arms and weapon were longer than his opponent's. No matter how many tricks there were, no matter how beautiful they were useless if they could not hit their target. In addition, Ifrit's strength and agility were superior, so Bree's spear pierced through his opponent's body first. Burning cloud form. Ifrit, who was almost defeated, quickly used his life-saving ability. He turned into a hot vortex of gas made of smoke and dust and slowly floated away. Want to run? It's not that easy. How could Bruley, whose fighting spirit had been aroused, let go of his opponent? He teleported to the side of the burning cloud that Ivrit had transformed into. The scorching gas couldn't hurt his strong body at all. Advanced Dispel Magic. This was a spell-like ability that Bree had obtained from the Baylor demon. A pale green light shot out from his fingertips and disappeared into the burning cloud in front of him. The hot gas suddenly started to return to its original form. The cruel Heartgouger Bree reached out his hand and touched the position of Ifrit's heart. The moment he returned to his original form, this guy was ready to dig out the heart of the fire element descendant and end his life. P.S. Words below will not count. I have created a discussion group for Scales of Eternal Order 6183822262. Everyone is welcome to join in the discussion. Currently, I have the outline part of my own drawing of the comic, the introduction of the Easter egg, the related historical knowledge, and the author's daily life have been released in the group. Readers who want to see more behind-the-scenes footage of the creation, please join in. Chapter 550. Bree's malicious palm was slapped away by another strong palm, which made him feel very angry. Someone actually stuck out his body from the wall of the tunnel and launched a collision and grab attack at him. Moreover, the strength of the attack was extraordinarily great. Stone bastard! The half-demon Tauren roared loudly and revealed the identity of the attacker. It turned out that he was an Oread, the descendant of the earth elementals. Don't leave the formation. These guys are not weak, the tall warrior said to Ivrit, who revealed his body. His voice was steady and firm, and he had a chiseled face. He looked like a statue that had come to life. As he spoke, he continued to tighten his arms. Of course, Bree, the heart gouger, did not do it for free. He suddenly spread his wings and propped up enough space for himself to move. Then he used his elbow to forcefully strike back. Slap! The half-demon Minotaur sucked in a breath of cold air in pain. However, even though Oread's body was strong and he had a layer of granite skin to protect his body, he still felt his internal organs churning. Taking advantage of this opening, Bree turned around immediately. He used the fine iron spear in his hand as a club and swung it at the head of Oread, who had just grabbed him. This descendant of the earth elementals was obviously not made of stone. In the face of such a powerful head-on attack, he decisively retreated. At the same time, he activated his ability and hid in the wall. The spear made of fine iron cut off large pieces of gravel from the wall of the tunnel. Get rid of these annoying elementals, Bree said loudly to his companions behind him. Don't continue fighting. Remember our original mission. As he spoke, the half-demon Tauren turned around and swung his arm, sending Ivrit, who was trying to sneak attack him, flying. Then, regardless of the situation behind him, he simply rushed toward the remaining guards in front of him. Under the full sprint, Bree's speed was faster than a galloping horse. Before he crashed into the defense line, he cunningly used a high-level teleportation spell and went behind the group of guards who were waiting for him. Other than Ivrit and Oread, the remaining guards were a group of tall, strong, and muscular earth goblins. Although they had the word gnome in their name, gnomes were actually slightly shorter than humans. Long arms, thick bodies, and short legs give them an ape-like appearance. After being exposed to the scorching sun for a long time, the disgusting grayish-green skin of the great earth goblin deepened to a dark green color. Its orange or red eyes shone with a cruel light, and its broad face and sharp ears showed some feline characteristics. These gnomes were nominally under the control of the two elemental descendants, but in reality, they only obeyed the orders of the sergeant. Therefore, when the two elemental descendants attacked the half-abyssal Minotaur, these gnomes didn't go forward to support them. Instead, they formed a defensive shield wall on the spot according to the Sergeant Major's instructions. According to the Sergeant Major's judgment, the infiltration of this group of enemies was most likely to find some valuable targets to destroy. As long as he was trapped here, it wouldn't take long for reinforcements to arrive. Therefore, there was no need to forcefully attack and increase the number of casualties. His idea couldn't be said to be wrong, but it was a pity that he lacked understanding of the target he was besieging. This group of half-abyssal minotaurs had mastered advanced teleportation abilities. Using ordinary methods to besiege them was bound to be futile. The only effective way was to fight as much as possible. They were not like real demons who were used to using teleportation spells in high-intensity battles. Soon, the gnomes were caught in a dilemma due to the Sergeant Major's misjudgment. The half-abyssal minotaurs began to attack them from the front and back. Even though they quickly shrank into a circular formation and set up a shield wall on the outside, they still couldn't take care of the front and back. "Hold the enemies back," Ivrit and Ariel said, trying to take some of the pressure off the ground goblins. "If you're afraid of death now, be prepared to go to the labor camp for the rest of your life," they threatened the ground goblins. Perhaps rationality overcame fear, or perhaps the term labor camp had a different kind of magic, but the gnome's sergeant major immediately changed his attitude. He used the whip in his hand to whip his cowering subordinates and shouted loudly, "Did you hear that, you potential losers?" With the sergeant major's whip, many gnomes began to go berserk. Their fangs were exposed in their mouths. Death isn't that scary. At least it's 10,000 times better than suffering in the labor camp. Finally, a gnome who was holed up in the shield formation couldn't withstand the mental pressure anymore. He screamed and rushed out. He was whipped until he was dripping with blood, but the crisscrossing wounds quickly healed and a thick layer of cuticle grew out. In addition to the chain armor he was wearing, this gnome seemed to have put on 2 layers of armor. He rushed toward a half-abyssal minotaur. Although he wasn't Heartgouger Bree, the minotaur's strength and size could still crush him. The long-handled battle-axe broke the spear in the gnome's hand and wedged it into his shoulder. However, the gnome, who was already on the verge of madness, didn't seem to feel anything. Splat! This gnome used the momentum of the attack to thrust the broken spear forward and stabbed it into the minotaur's groin. The indescribable pain made the half-abyssal minotaur completely lose control. The battle-axe flew up and down and chopped this gnome into mincemeat. However, this sudden situation was like a fuse. When all the gnomes saw this scene, they understood that this group of powerful invaders wasn't invincible. They could be injured and feel pain. Don't get caught up in the battle here. Seeing that the gnomes had spread out and were fighting the half-abyssal minotaurs with their lives, Bree, who was the leader, quickly killed a few enemies in front of him. He then roared loudly, "Don't forget our mission." His roar was just right. Some of the half-abyssal minotaurs who were in a killing frenzy were immediately alerted. They risked being hit a few times and used high-level teleportation spells to leave this part of the tunnel. They continued to attack the artillery base. However, the gnomes' desperate encirclement still bought them some time. Not long after they walked out, a creaking sound came from the front. The wall of the tunnel was opened by a mechanism, and more mercenaries from other planes walked out. "Kill those half-abyssal bastards." A few leading orc wolf riders patted the heads of their mounts and raised their weapons. They began to charge at the half-abyssal minotaurs. The remaining mercenaries from other dimensions also displayed their abilities and began to attack this group of vulgar bastards who were trying to invade their territory. Chapter 551. In order to accommodate the different sizes of different races, when the roads in Traction City were built, the main tunnel was designed to be very wide and tall. It could at least accommodate a dozen wolf riders walking side by side without feeling crowded. Green-skinned bastards riding stupid dogs. Facing the charging orc wolf riders, a trace of disdain flashed in Brulee's eyes. Even before he became a half-demon, he would not be afraid of a few orcs and dire wolves. "You really don't have good eyesight. If you want to die so much, I'll grant you your wish." He did not use his newly acquired spell-like ability. He only waved the spear in his hand, took a step forward, and charged forward. He was confident that this group of orcs would not last more than a few breaths before being killed by him. However, Brulee really miscalculated this time. The orc wolf riders didn't actually plan to engage in a melee with him. When they charged over, they all took out a strange-looking gun from their saddle pouches. Slime net, fire! Thanks to the use of mice energy nuclei, low-level magic items were quickly popularized in New Prosperity Town. They only needed to make a mold for adding magic circles, and then imprint the magic circle on the item that needed to be enchanted. All kinds of new weapons were created one by one. The slime net gun was one of the examples. As long as the trigger was pulled, this gun would shoot out a net with extremely strong adhesive. The shooter who used this gun did not need any spellcasting ability. They only needed to know how to aim and remember the time needed to form the slime. Obviously, this weapon was very suitable for the orc wolf riders, so each of them was equipped with one. After receiving the order from their leader, they immediately raised their guns and fired. Poof, 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 poof. After a few strange gunshots, the half-demon minotaur was covered in slime. Although this slime was only a colloid summoned by a low-level web spell, it was superior in quantity. No matter how Bruley tried to tear it, he could not get rid of it. Body of Flames. Bruley had no choice but to use an ability that he did not really want to use. Raging flames spewed out from his muscles and burned the slime on his body. However, because he was not immune to fire damage, a large area of his skin was burned. The smoke from the burning glue, coupled with the stimulation of pain, made the half-demon Tauren's eyes turn red. He roared angrily and lowered his head to attack the closest orc wolf rider. Unable to dodge, the dire wolf beneath the orc had its head pierced by the bullhorn. The rider on the orc's back could only hurriedly slide off the back of his mount and scramble to retreat to the tunnel behind him. After losing their mounts, the wolf riders lost most of their abilities. In the face of a half-demon minotaur, they couldn't gain the slightest advantage. Greater teleportation. Bruley, who had wanted to take advantage of the situation to pursue and attack, activated the spell-like ability inherited from the Baylor demon. However, he remained where he was. Not far away, 3 muscular blood-armored demon guards suddenly showed up in the tunnel. They all had malicious smiles on their faces. As the main force of the Blood War, the blood-armored demons, who fought demons all year round, had the ability of dimensional interference. Unless it was an extremely powerful spellcaster, no one could use teleportation to launch a surprise attack or escape in front of them. In addition to these blood-armored demons, other reinforcements had also rushed to this tunnel. Among them, the figures of 3 frost giants in chainmail were the most eye-catching. These 3 giants looked like thick and muscular humans, but they had frosty white skin and light blue hair braided into long braids. Like their hair, their beards were shaved clean, and their broad cheeks were covered with tattoos with dark blue dye. They were all priests of the god of frost giants, Thalum. They used to work under General Kiru, but were later subdued by the ogre Naruto. After being transformed by the labor camp, they had now become the city guards of the new boomtown. Winter is coming. Before launching the attack, these 3 frost giant priests all loudly chanted the prayers of Thalum. The big axes in their hands began to be wrapped in frost, and the temperature in this tunnel dropped a little. With the chants, spells such as Eagle's Majesty, Bull's Strength, and Owl's Insight were gradually attached to them, increasing the combat power of the frost giants. Kill them. After completing the preparation before the battle, the 3 frost giant priests immediately launched a charge. Although they were spellcasters, the priests of Thalum would still display amazing melee ability in battle. The priest spells that they often cast were generally for the sake of winning hand-to-hand combat, and it was a buff that they cast on themselves. And what made people speechless was that even with the help of various spells, the frost giant priests still maintained the good habit of never fighting alone if they could fight in groups. Facing the half-demon minotaurs that were only slightly smaller than them, they were even more cautious. Not only did they use buffs on them, but they also used some unusual methods. The 3 frost giants charged forward in an inverted triangle formation. The 2 frost giants in front blocked the other frost giant behind them, making it easier for them to make some small moves. It was not until the frost giant at the back finished casting that they moved aside in a timely manner, allowing the frost giant to direct an extremely vicious ice crystal blast towards the half-demon minotaurs. Bang! With a crisp sound, frost and broken ice suddenly appeared on Bruley's body. Because his skin had just been burned by flames, after receiving the sudden cold damage, a large area of his skin directly cracked open, and blood gushed out in an instant. But this was only the damage on the surface. The real damage was still hidden in the curse hidden in the ice crystal blast. The fine broken ice had already invaded the blood vessels of the half-demon minotaurs, blocking the circulation of the blood in his body. What was more fatal was that the ice crystals began to flow along with the blood flow and began to flow into his heart. And if a large number of ice crystals were poured into the heart, there would be sudden stops in light cases, and in serious cases, the sharp ice crystals might cut the heart and cause death. The only suitable action to deal with this situation was to try to slow down the circulation of the blood as much as possible. and quietly heal oneself by healing the serious injuries or removing the curse. But Bruley did not have such an opportunity at all. Confined in place by the blood-armored demon's dimensional interference, he was facing an unstoppable battle. And in the middle of a battle, how could he slow down the circulation of his blood? In the end, this half-demon minotaurs nicknamed Heart Gouger fell to the ground with their hands covering their hearts. Then, they were chopped into meat paste by the frost giants and blood-armored demons that rushed over. Chapter 552. Other than the team led by Heart Gouger Bree, there were two other teams that they had lost contact with. There was no doubt that the half-demon minotaurs had died in Traction City. As for the rest, it was only a matter of time before they were wiped out. The dead half-demon minotaurs were different from real demons. Their corpses would rarely rot quickly and turn into a pool of pus or foam with a shocking stench. Instead, they were like creatures from the material plane. They needed to be gathered together and carefully cleaned, because if these things were left where they were, a plague might breed in New Prosperity Town. Therefore, after they were killed, the labor camp immediately dispatched a large number of people to use reinforced flatbed carts to transport the corpses to the manure tank in the corner of the city. There, the corpses of the half-demon minotaurs would be dismembered. Then, some of the valuable materials would be recycled. The rest of the waste would be degraded into fertilizer and used as feed for the flesh-eating acid mistworms. It could be considered as the final compensation for the damage that the half-demon minotaurs had caused to the city. Buzz, buzz, buzz. The sound of chainsaws cutting into minced meat was deafening. The laborers in the manure tank workshop were busy without stopping. The laborers working here were the last batch of laborers in New Prosperity Town. Each of them was extremely vicious and had tenacious vitality. Otherwise, they would have been turned into soul prisms long ago. A certain jackalen with scabies on his body was using tools to cut up materials. When no one was paying attention, he picked up some of the half-demon minotaur's flesh and stuffed it into his mouth. He barely chewed before stuffing the extra meal into his stomach. Most of the other laborers in the area also had the same extra meal behavior. It had become their survival instinct to not let go of any opportunity to replenish their nutrition. Apu, glancing at the barbed demon guard who was supervising his work, the jackalen shifted his body to cover up his spitting into the manure tank. He threw a section of the tibia that had been shaved clean behind him. The bone remains there had been piled up into a pile. After a while, the pile of bones would be taken away and sent to the machine to be ground into powder. The jackalen was now fiddling with the head of a half-demon minotaur. According to the requirements, he had to remove the horns and wait for the spellcaster to collect them alone. You've wasted your sharp teeth. You're just eating rotten meat to satisfy your hunger, just to fill your stomach. An inexplicable voice sounded in the gnoll's ears. He was so nervous that his ears perked up. His triangular eyes looked around, trying to find out who was so bold as to talk to him at work. But after searching for a long time, there were no suspicious figures around. His nose twitched twice, but he also smelled the inherent rotting smell of the manure tank, as well as the smell of the flesh and blood of the half-demon minotaurs. Wait a minute. The gnoll's eyes stared at the bull's head in his hand. The eyes on the bull's head actually turned, and the corners of its mouth curled up into a mocking smile. Isn't meat delicious? Why do you have to eat shit here, every day? Being mocked by a dead guy, the gnoll first felt fear, and then an emotion called anger, which seemed to have been forgotten by it for a long time, defeated its reason and ignited a spark in its heart. You bastard! How dare you talk to me like that? He lowered his voice, and the people next to him could only hear a few gurgling sounds from his throat. See if I don't dig out your eyes and chew them in front of you. I believe the half-demon minotaur's mouth closed again, but the rustling sound still reached the gnoll's ears. After all, you used to be a qualified thug, the Max that everyone was afraid of. It's Mad Max, it's Wolf Hunter Max. The gnoll's face showed a ferocious expression. Then he gritted his teeth and said, "It's the younger brother of Slaughter Demon Wolf Max." The voice that came from nowhere evoked an unforgettable memory for Max. This Knoll was originally a warrior with a great future, but because his brother was jealous of him, he was expelled from the wolf pack for a reason. In order to take revenge, Max signed a contract with the devil and gained more power. However, when he found his brother who framed him, he had already died in the hands of a minotaur who was an enemy of the Knoll tribe. It seemed that his heart had been dug out. Max couldn't remember what happened at that time, but because the conditions of the contract had been fulfilled, he couldn't escape from the hands of the devil in the end and was kidnapped to the 9 prisons of Bader. After that, this guy was reduced to a Gu Yongbin from another plane, thrown into a bloody battle by the devils as cannon fodder. To be honest, with his strength, he had been doing well in the early days. Bullying newbies and bullying the weak were all natural talents he had learned from his bones. That was until Quest built Boomtown and used his great power to rebuild order. This unstable guy was thrown into the labor camp on the first day the young Blue Dragon took office. There was no chance for him to be pardoned, and he had to live every day without speaking. Mad Max's spirit was gradually worn down, and his only thought was to struggle to live a few more days. But today, the strange words that the dead Minotaur told him had reinvigorated his numbed nerves. He felt resentment and anger, but also hope. You're a Knoll destined to do great things. Suffering will only make you more ferocious. The strange voice sounded again, but Max's eyes became a little determined. Sometimes, you just need to push yourself, and the spark can start a prairie fire. His voice, which was as loud as a bell, resounded in Max's mind. Like a ghost, he stood up abruptly, looked at the pile of Minotaur bones behind him, and reached out his hand with new claws. Bang! Raging flames rose into the air, and the pile of bones was like a burning bonfire. Then, one after another, more and more laborers repeated Max's actions, and the whole dung tank was filled with smoke from the bonfire. Seeing this, the barb demons on duty wanted to take action immediately, but just as they were about to teleport to the dung tank and slaughter the laborers who dared to cause trouble, something strange happened. Cough, cough, cough. Smoke poured into their throats, and the barb demons all coughed, unable to concentrate to use spell-like abilities. Then, something even more terrifying happened. These Batsid devils, who had amazing physiques, started coughing and vomiting blood at the same time. Their bodies gradually withered, and finally they were all unconscious on the ground. Chapter 553. The entire manure storage tank workshop was already filled with yellow-green smoke. All the alarms had been activated and were relaying information to the outside world about the anomaly. The barb demon guards were all lying on the ground, and it was unknown whether they were dead or alive. I heard that this place is called the intestine of the city. A chilling voice suddenly rang out. Then I'd like to see if the intestine that flows out after a big hole in the digestive tract can digest this city. Ha ha ha. Along with the terrifying laughter, the flames on the bonfire instantly turned into a demonic red. They no longer produced smoke, but started to ignite. Explosions rang out one after another, and bumps appeared on the metal walls of the workshop. Finally, the pressure resistance of the building materials reached the threshold. In an explosion that shook the entire city, the wall of the manure storage tank workshop was torn open with a jagged wound. From this wound, a large amount of sticky, soft mud gushed out. Not only was the ooze stinky, but it was also constantly changing shape. It looked like a half-melted humanoid creature. As it continued to squirm, its face gradually appeared. It was the face of Max the werewolf. If you're hungry, you'll eat meat. Through Max's mouth, the ooze issued its own declaration of action. Its filthy body rolled and twitched. The yellowish-brown mass extended its amorphous pseudo-legs in all directions and used them as support points to pull itself forward. The explosion of the dung tank attracted the demon guards who were originally on duty in the intestine of the city. They cautiously blocked the path of the ooze and did not attack. Instead, they waited for the commander's orders. Fire, ice, and sound wave. Attack with these 3 forms first. The commander was a Dominion demon. He held a war hammer and observed for a moment. He used his experience to formulate a battle plan against the ooze. Try not to get close to it. Upon receiving the commander's order, the demon guards quickly acted. A few spiked demons used flare and scorching ray spell-like abilities respectively. The bone demons cast ice wall on the ooze, trying to cut it in half. The Dominion demon swung his hammer and released a lesser sound wave ball as a test attack. With the ooze's movement speed, it would not be able to dodge so many attacks. When the flames landed on its body, they burned blisters that looked like pustules, but they were immediately extinguished. A cold ice wall appeared in its body, and it seemed to have some effect. It began to twist and turn continuously until the ice wall was completely shattered. As for the inferior sonic ball hitting its body, damn it, don't use sound wave spells. This sludge monster will automatically split apart when attacked by sound waves. Seeing the slightly smaller clump of mud in front of him, the tyrannical hero frowned and announced loudly. Just as the Devil Guards were about to use their spell-like abilities to deal a second blow to the disgusting mud creature, the smaller ball of ooze suddenly disappeared in front of them, leaving only the larger ball of ooze in its place. At the same time, in the quenching tank of a smelting factory in the intestine of the city, a large yellowish-brown stain suddenly appeared in the originally clear oil. The few gray dwarven craftsmen who were standing by the side all had doubtful looks on their faces. They had just wanted to soak the finished parts in the oil to cool them down, but after seeing the stain, they became hesitant. Go and report to the chief technician. A gray dwarf who looked like a team leader roared at his younger assistant. Tell him that there's something abnormal in the cooling tank. Maybe someone is deliberately sabotaging our production progress. In order to increase production efficiency, there were many factories in the intestine of the city, and every factory had craftsmen of different races. There was a competitive relationship between them, which was why the gray dwarf team leader suspected that someone else was sabotaging them. However, he had guessed wrongly this time, and the consequences were severe. Just as he was about to collect some of the stain to keep as evidence, the ball of stain suddenly jumped out of the cooling tank and completely enveloped him. Without any cry for help, the gray dwarf team leader's flesh and blood melted away in an instant. After eating its fill, the ball of mud grew a little bigger, and the number of tentacles and artificial legs on its body began to increase. Seeing that their team leader was swallowed up, the irritable gray dwarven craftsmen all spontaneously rushed over. Some of them swung their hot forging hammers and hit the body of the mud monster hard. Some took out their heating tools and used them to spray flammable, blazing fire glue at the ooze, try to burn it to death. However, the ooze was much more cunning than they had imagined. Being hit by the smithing hammer did not cause any harm to it. Instead, it would seize the opportunity to devour the attacking gray dwarf. Although the blazing fire glue had ignited its body, it had used the flames to break out of the siege of the fire dwarf craftsman. Along the way, it had wantonly set fire and destruction on fire. In just a few moments, the smelting factory was set ablaze. The ooze also took the opportunity to swallow more gray dwarves, and quickly degraded them into its own mud. The flames on its body were no longer burning, and its body had expanded several times. In the end, it also split into new oozes. The factories in the intestine of the city were attacked by these monsters one after another, and the demon guard stationed here had to go to various places to put out the fires. But even if they destroyed the oozes that attacked the factories, they would still teleport most of their bodies away at the last moment. And these oozes that were teleported away would eventually return to the original monster. They fused into the body of the monster with the face of Nolmax, causing its body to grow rapidly. Soon, it became a behemoth as big as a hill. Just looking at its size was enough to make people afraid. The overlord demon who led the demon guards to fight against it had to use magic to investigate and finally figure out what it was. Fleshy ooze, nicknamed Mad Max. It has a paranoid love for flesh and blood, and the demon lord was involved in its birth process. It is immune to acid and poison, has a certain resistance to fire, and is vulnerable to cold. Sound waves and physical damage will cause it to split. After splitting, The fleshy ooze has the ability to teleport. Within a certain range, it can appear in any liquid. After splitting, the fleshy ooze will automatically hunt flesh and blood creatures and have the habit of feeding back to the original body. Chapter 554. Just like how severe abdominal pain would make a swift walker bend down, the sudden change in the intestine of the city slowed down the entire Traction City. Many decks began to tremble. Although it was not violent, it was entirely due to Shay's powerful mechanical operation skills. Under the skirt of New Boom Town, the large hydraulic device stretched out its 8 claws, and the spikes at the tip grasped the ground. With the spray of brake coolant, a lot of steam came out between the driving wheels, and the track of the Traction City greatly reduced its speed in a short time. In order to overcome the inertia brought by the huge mass, the mobile fortress had a violent friction with the ground, and a small plowed hill was piled up in front of each track and claw. The low-level fiend worms that couldn't escape in time were all buried in it. Even with the reinforcement device, many machines in the factories of the intestine of the city were shifted during the sudden stop. The furnaces of several smelting factories directly overturned, and the melted or half-melted metal flowed out and began to spread wantonly in all directions, covering the ground of the intestine of the city. Because of this, many of the fleshy slime splits were scalded or burned to death, and the growth of their main bodies was slowed down a lot. This gave the devils some advantage. After all, Batsu was immune to fire damage, and they fought desperately while bathed in flames. P.S. Below is not counted in the word count. A discussion group for Scales of Eternity has been established, and everyone is welcome to come in and discuss. At present, there is an outline, part of the manga form, an introduction of the Easter egg, related historical knowledge, and the author's daily life in the group. Readers who want to see more behind-the-scenes highlights of the creation, please join. However, due to the high temperature, the spell effect of the cold damage was greatly reduced, and the fleshy slime's constitution was getting stronger and stronger through devouring. The frostbite caused by the frost and severe cold would not last long in its body. Moreover, the knoll head of this mud-shaped monster had now become much bigger, and its intelligence seemed to have increased a little. Its 2 triangular eyes showed a cunning look, and it seemed to be up to no good. The fleshy slime stretched out a large number of tentacle-like pseudo-legs and fiercely whipped several barbed devils nearby. It had done this before, but those were just ordinary physical attacks, and the devil guards could easily withstand them with their tenacity. But now it wasn't just that. Flesh absorption. Bloody wounds appeared on the bodies of the barbed devils that were attacked. It was as if the tentacles had grown mouths and were biting off large amounts of flesh and blood. The faces of those unlucky devils quickly turned a strange black color, and white foam came out of their mouths. They struggled to escape, but in the end, they all fell to the ground and were completely devoured by the fleshy ooze. Be careful of bleeding wounds. The hero demon holding the warhammer raised his arm and shouted, "This thing is poisonous." Under his reminder, the Batsu warrior became even more cautious. They either cast spells from afar or picked up the half-solidified metal on the floor to make simple shields to protect themselves. Some of the smarter ones even scooped up handfuls of molten metal and threw it directly at the flesh-sucking ooze. The mud-shaped monster that was splashed with the metal solution hissed and emitted an unbearable stench. The knoll on its head opened its mouth and howled in pain. Obviously, as its intelligence increased, the flesh-sucking ooze slowly understood what pain was. It began to try to avoid the spells and the metal solution, as well as actively counterattack. The flesh-sucking ooze dug its pseudo-legs deep into the stone walls and floor, but not many devils noticed this detail. Those who noticed this detail only thought that it wanted to grab the things around it to move forward. Wall of sharp teeth. Flesh membrane as thin as a cicada's wing suddenly rose from the cracks in the floor and walls. Countless teeth hung on it. These teeth all came from the unlucky devils that were devoured by the flesh-sucking ooze. They were of different sizes and shapes. Because it happened so suddenly, The devil guards did not have time to react before they were separated. They were all surrounded by 3 or 4 walls of sharp teeth. Some of the Batsu warrior immediately cast a teleportation spell, and thus they escaped. Those who did not react in time were all bitten by thousands of teeth. Even with their rough skin and thick flesh, there were many teeth marks on their scaly bodies. A large number of broken teeth were embedded in the devil's bodies, and their cries of pain rose and fell one after another. Moreover, these bites are the same as the pseudo-legs from before. They were also laced with poison, and the devils who were bitten instantly fell into a state of paralysis. The flesh-sucking ooze took this opportunity to move its body to the area covered by the wall of sharp teeth. The devils that were paralyzed by the poison were all wrapped up by the flesh-sucking ooze's body and began to be devoured. The gnoll's head grew a lot bigger, and fine scales grew on its face. It could even speak coherently. The flesh of devils is equally sweet. Max is not a werewolf, but a demon-hunting wolf. Just as he was spouting nonsense, the tyrannical male demon with the warhammer revealed a sinister smile. "Is that so?" he said disdainfully. "Dreams cannot be unrealistic." He slammed the warhammer in his hand on the ground. Cold fire. The flesh-sucking ooze's body suddenly swelled, as if something had exploded in its body. The surface of its body was instantly torn apart, and cold air gushed out from the wounds. Ice crystals began to condense in its body. It turned out that the Overlord demon had already discovered the mud-shaped monster's intentions, so he beat it at its own game and conveniently left some fragments in the body of a barbed demon guard. When the flesh-sucking ooze swallowed that barbed demon, the casting material was also swallowed into its body. The Overlord demon took this opportunity to directly detonate it. Under the influence of cold fire, even with the flesh-sucking ooze's body as a barrier, the temperature of the intestine of the city suddenly dropped by a lot. The metal liquid that was originally in a half-melted state instantly solidified into lumps of metal. The monster that had been feeling smug just a moment ago could no longer make any sound. Its entire body was frozen by the crystallized ice. "Smash it into powder," the Overlord demon roared at his subordinates. "Then burn all the powder into nothingness." The devil guards were excited. For the Batsu, participating in the work of destroying a powerful enemy had always been one of the greatest joys of his life. They naturally gladly obeyed and did not feel the slightest bit sorry for their comrade that had just been sacrificed. Looking at his energetic subordinates, the Overlord demon stood up straight and twirled his warhammer with his fingers. But just as he let his guard down, a pitch-black machete suddenly appeared behind him and chopped straight at the Overlord demon's head. Chapter 555. You Can't Wait. Feeling the wind at the back of his head, the strong Overlord demon showed a mocking smile on his face. He only said a few words. The machete targeted his body and passed through it without any hindrance, but not a single drop of blood flowed out. The sneak attack was successful, but it only destroyed an illusion. Buffett was obviously caught unprepared by his own failure. He found it hard to imagine that the Overlord demon had such high magic attainments, to be able to deceive the demon lord's eyes and confuse his hearing and hearing. But he immediately knew the reason. The back of his neck had been hit hard. That familiar feeling and weight made him suddenly realize that this was the weapon that had once destroyed his other incarnation. "It's you." That's right. Due to the reminder of the dragon head Warhammer hammer, Buffett finally understood that the Overlord demon was actually the young blue dragon disguised as a fake goods, specifically used to lure him into a sneak attack. At this moment, the Tauren King could be said to be both shocked and angry. He was shocked that his trick had been seen through, and now he might have fallen into a trap. He was angry that he had actually fallen into the same person's hands twice. His reputation as a demon lord had been completely destroyed. Ironheart School. Iron dissipating strength. Ignoring the other party's question, Keyes directly used the Ironheart School's martial arts. Using the Dragon Head Warhammer with excellent balance, he smashed the machete that Buffett had placed horizontally in front of his chest after he turned around. Although it didn't directly shatter the legendary weapon, Hammer still took the opportunity to bite a large hole in the blade. The back of his neck was hit, and then the young blue dragon's attack had the characteristic of vibration. Even with the Towering King's strength and physique, he still felt half of his body go numb, and his chi and blood began to roll up. But he didn't show it at all. Instead, he first used his nose to snort and spat out a cone-shaped stream of water with negative energy, forming a barrier in front of him to guard against Keys' next attack. Then, he shook the machete in his hand, and the legendary weapon released a crescent-shaped energy blade, shooting towards the young blue dragon. Steel's soul-style, seraphic speed body. Facing the incoming energy blade, Keys decisively used the Steel Spirit Sex martial technique to increase his agility. While dodging the attack, he circled behind Buffett. He didn't even need to go around Buffett completely. He only needed to find a suitable angle to use the Shadow Hand School's secret assassination technique and inflict heavy damage on Buffett. Shadow Hand Stream. 5 Shadows Entanglement. Through a beautiful twist and thrust, Keys circled around to the back of the Towering King and used the Dragon Head War Hammer to smash the other party's back. Since he had already hit his opponent once, Keys had already implanted part of his shadow energy into Buffett's body as a seed. Now, all he had to do was detonate it and wait for the shadows to cover the Demon Lord's heart and spread to his limbs along the blood vessels. However, after being hit, Buffett's figure only shook a little before exploding, turning into a large cloud of mist made entirely of negative energy, quickly spreading in all directions. Keys frowned. Water clone. He recognized the technique used by the opponent to lure the enemy. Without any hesitation, he quickly retreated, and, at the same time, he cast a resist negative energy spell on himself. As it turned out, his choice was correct. The negative energy contained in the mist was terrifying. In the process of its spread, anything that came into contact with it would immediately decay. Even metals and rocks were no exception. Advanced Dispel Spell. He didn't know when Buffett had appeared behind Quest. First, he used a spell-like ability to disperse the protective spell on the young blue dragon's body. Then, he lowered his head and bent his waist, suddenly launching an unavoidable horn charge. The thick horns penetrated the flesh, and with the strong inertia, the Towering King suddenly pushed his opponent into the area covered by the mist of negative energy. Accompanied by a painful wail, the demon that was penetrated quickly decayed into dust. It turned out that after realizing that his attack had failed, Keys not only pretended to retreat, but also launched a substitution spell that he had set up in advance, swapping places with a barbed demon. That unlucky guy, apart from having his bones broken by Buffett, was also baptized by the mist of negative energy. In the end, not even a complete corpse was left. Damn it! The Towering King shook his neck and shook off the remains of the barbed demon. Then, he roared loudly, "You coward who only knows how to use tricks. Don't you dare to fight a proper battle for once." This sentence was actually a joke. Who didn't know that although the level of these demon lords wasn't very high, these demons of the lower realm who were driven by their nature were the ones who were the most passionate about playing tricks? Of course, Keys didn't refute his idea. The young blue dragon only wanted to beat the Towering King down as soon as possible. He realized that the opponent's avatar was obviously good at fighting. Just now, he used the moves from the 9-sword catalog, but in the end, he didn't gain any advantage. So he decisively changed his fighting style, and in a flash, he became a powerful cannon-type spellcaster. This was because Keys had a mice energy nucleus in his hands. In order to make it convenient to carry, Keys directly let the small hammer swallow the mice energy nucleus into its stomach. This way, on one hand, it could provide some protection for the mice energy nucleus, and on the other hand, he could use the transformation characteristics of the Dragon Head War Hammer to form different magic arrays at any time and anywhere, and use the power of the mice energy nucleus to cast spells. Holding this War Hammer, he only needed to move his mind, and he could cast mid to low-level spells at will. Even if the high-level spells were more complicated and couldn't be fully activated with magic arrays, keys could still increase the casting speed with the hammer, and at the same time, increase the effects of the spells. And Buffett immediately experienced the terror of the Cannon Mage. Dimensional Anchor, Dimensional Interference, and other spells that disrupted the high-level teleportation ability were almost non-stop. High-level Phantom Killer, Death's Command, and Brain Invasion would be cast when he was unprepared. The dazzling patterns released close to his face didn't blind his eyes. Although his resistance to necromancy spells was very high, the Withering spell that could be cast every once in a while still made his heart clench, and the pressure was great in front of the Cannon Mage, who held the mice energy nucleus. A dignified demon lord didn't have any good way to deal with it. Buffett had already been beaten to the point where he covered his head and scurried away like a rat, almost without any strength to fight back. The Cannon Mage was so terrifying. Note, too, that you're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.